Chapter 852. True energy slowly entered Huai Caoshi's thin body, causing her to cough again. Looking at her pale face, Sulu knew that she was heavily injured. The earth-shattering mecha battle on Mo Hua planet appeared in his mind, and he frowned slightly, thinking that Madman Li should also be heavily injured. In an instant, he overthrew this thought. Although Huai Caoshi had the most terrifying battle power in the universe, when she led the mecha group to attack Du Shaoqing, she was facing an enemy that was several times or even dozens of times stronger than her. Li Feng had been silently guarding beside Du Shaoqing, waiting for an exhausted enemy, so in comparison, he had a much easier time. Su Li's lips could not help but curl up into a complicated smile when he thought of the pinnacle dialogue between the Universe Supreme Masters. The blood in his heart only rippled slightly, but more than that, he was still deeply moved by the encounters in life. If he had not encountered such a steep and huge wave in his life, no matter if it was the first wave when he was an ignorant baby or the wave when his identity as an Imperial was exposed, he would have appeared on Mo Hua planet right now, standing on one side of the Federation or the Empire, controlling the little white flower MXT to fight against the other side. Huai Caoshi raised her right fist and lightly hit her chest twice, temporarily suppressing the injury in her lungs. She slowly pushed his arm away, looked up at his thoughtful expression, and guessed what he was thinking. She shook her head and said, "Madman Li does not dare to take the risk like me, because he does not know when I will appear. As long as he leaves, Du Shaoqing may die. But the Empire's general on Mo Hua planet may also be killed by him," Sulu said. "The Empire's general can line up to die, but if Du Shaoqing dies, where will the Federation find such a genius and crazy general?" Huai Caoshi said expressionlessly. Her calm tone did not hide her fear and even admiration for Du Shaoqing. Sulu sat back in his chair and picked up the teacup, wanting to drink. However, he put it down slowly and looked at her, asking in a deep voice, "Are you still going back to Mo Hua planet?" Neither side can bear the consequences of losing Mo Hua planet. The Federation needs a strategic jump base, and we need to grab them by the throat. More importantly, this is where the Empire's momentum lies. After a slight pause, Huai Caoshi looked into his eyes, which were even clearer than before, and said, "Neither side can afford to lose that planet, but in fact, both sides can't hold on for much longer. Whether it's the logistics, the fatigue of the troops, or the most troublesome of all, the death rate, none of these can sustain the battle any longer." According to the intelligence, the Iron 7th Division and the 17th Division are temporarily replenishing their troops. You can imagine how miserable this battle is, and how difficult the supply of troops for the Federation is facing. Hearing the name of the 17th Division, Su Li's eyes narrowed, as if he didn't want the dusty light in front of him to turn into a blood-red battlefield. He didn't want to think about how many of his former comrades and subordinates had turned into cold corpses on that black fertile land. "My troops seem to be in a worse situation, but in fact, as long as we can hold on for another 2 months, the Federation forces will definitely not be able to maintain such a strong offensive state. Why did Du Shaoqing become crazier and stronger recently? It's because he knows this better than anyone else. I don't know the situation in the war zone very well." Sulu replied purely subconsciously. He did not expect Huai Caoshi to take out the electronic battlefield command map without hesitation. She opened the top-secret military deployment map and data analysis linear chart and pointed at a certain area in the war zone that was dyed red. "My Maple Leaf Alliance is defending the Starry Gorge at all costs. Behind them is a continuous stretch of developed graphite mines. The Federation forces in charge of attacking this area are 9 integrated Westwoods mechanics. According to some unreliable information, the commander of these Westwoods troops is a certain acquaintance of yours. If Du Shaoqing uses his right wing to help him suppress our side, I will not hesitate to give the order to blow up all the graphite mines. This is the Kyle crater in the southern half of the planet. It is the best natural landing spot for a large fleet. I have destroyed 60% of the Federation's current air-to-air transport cabins. They need this landing spot, but I have placed 3 mecha teams here. If Du Shaoqing decides to fight with his life on the line, I will send the last reserve of the Royal Mecha Battalion to receive him. This is the Azure Sea. In history, the libraries of human society had always been the birthplace of countless major events. There had been countless powerful figures who had left behind their lonely shadows before they had made their mark in the library. Today, such a story had also happened in the library of Sang Ku Town Public School, which was made up of a dilapidated hut and hundreds of books. The sun shone through the glass window and shone on the 2 people sitting at the tea table. Huai Caoshi frowned slightly and spoke clearly and steadily. Su Li's thick eyebrows were tightly knitted together. He listened with a serious expression and did not say a word. No one knew that they were discussing an important battle that would decide the balance of the war between the Federation and the Empire. Huai Chaoshu finished her precise analysis of the battle. She picked up the cold tea expressionlessly and finished it in one gulp. She moistened her throat and made the final conclusion. The Federation is an evil guest from afar, but we are fighting in our own home. If the war on Mo planet continues to develop like this, no matter how undefeatable Du Shaoqing is, he will only be able to obtain the most miserable victory in the end. The Federation has prepared too many resources for this battle. Most importantly, most of the veterans who can fight will not be able to survive. Sulu was silent for a long time. He stretched out his fingers and massaged his aching brows. He asked in a low voice, "Why are you telling me this? A clear-headed general should know what kind of battles can be fought and what kind of battles can't be fought. He must choose the right time to stop or retreat gracefully." Sulu raised his head. His thick eyebrows were knitted again. He said, "As I said just now, I don't have that kind of ability. I can't imagine myself being responsible for thousands of lives. Also, I can't fight for the Empire. Please understand this." "I don't understand, but I respect it. Therefore, I am telling you this not because I want you to go to Mo planet to lead my troops. Even if you are willing, I will not be at ease putting the lives of 2 million brave soldiers in your hands." Huai Chaoshu said coldly, "But at least you have one advantage. The memory of an engineer has always been good. You should be able to remember everything I said just now without missing a single word. Then, I hope that if you have the chance to meet your former subordinates in the future, you can tell Du Shaoqing my opinion." Hearing these words and understanding the true intentions of the Empire, Su Li's knitted eyebrows loosened bit by bit. A smile had just appeared on his face, but there was a lot of bitterness in it. "In the eyes of the Federation, I am now a prince of the Empire, not the successor of the military god back then. What I say has no meaning at all. Most importantly, I understand Du Shaoqing very well. For him, the honor of a soldier is very important, and discipline is even more important. As long as the Federation government wants the war to continue, then even if he is left with only one person, he will continue to fight." Huai Chaoshu narrowed her eyes. Some superficial information was not enough for her to understand Du Shaoqing deeply. This famous Federation general was like a thorn in the throat of the Empire's emperor. Sulu, who had a lot of contact with Du Shaoqing, should not be wrong in his judgment. Will the Federation government take the initiative to stop the war? Impossible. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked out of the window, as if he was looking at the official residence and Parliament Hill that he had not seen for a long time. A faint mocking smile appeared on his lips. As long as the war continues, Pabre's public support will not fall, and the army will expand. He does not even need continuous victories at the front lines. Even if it is a bitter defeat, it can be turned into his own political capital under his pen and those thick lips of his, helping him pass bill after bill on Parliament Hill, tightening the noose around the necks of the 7 great families even more. He turned his head to look at Huai Chaoshu and said softly, "The enemy you are facing is not Du Shaoqing, but Pabre. He is fighting a war with the Empire outside of the Empire's borders, but in fact, it is to fight a war within the Empire's borders. Don't think that he is just a propagandist who deceives the people with his speeches. It is already very impressive that he can make such a brilliant figure like Du Shaoqing to be dead set on him." "I understand that." Huai Chaoshu looked at him quietly and suddenly smiled. "But now, there are some new changes in the situation within the Federation. It seems that Mr. President has run into real trouble for the first time, or rather, a real heavyweight enemy. The war outside of the Empire's borders can no longer support his high-pressure rule. I suspect that he needs the troops that are truly loyal to him to return to the capital ring as some kind of symbol or pressure. The Federation is not stable internally, and Du Shaoqing is very likely to be transferred back to the capital ring." Huai Chaoshu raised her chin slightly and said, "Under such circumstances, it is very likely that the war on Mo will slow down. The Federation government under the leadership of Pabre showed its steel-like tough side to the 7 families for the first time in the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, announcing to the entire Federation the ultimate governing program. Sulu had experienced that turbulent period, so he naturally understood why the Federation government moved the Iron 7th Division back to S1 from the front lines. However, he could not imagine what kind of major event had happened within the Federation that would force President Pabre to take the risk of the front lines collapsing to transfer back the troops that were loyal to him. He looked at Huai Chaoshu in shock and asked, "What happened?" Huai Chaoshu looked at him calmly and said, "A good friend of yours started a movement called the Silent March half a month ago." "Taizi Yuan?" Sulu regained his composure and said his friend's name. "What is he planning to do?" According to his declaration, the Silent March is a civil rights movement that the Federation has never seen before. What is most unbelievable is that he claims to have obtained the support of the 3 major Federation unions and the Veteran Association. Hui Chaosher was silent for a moment and said, "To defeat Pabre in his strongest field, the method your friend chose is brave and powerful. Although he is a member of the Federation, I still admire him." Chapter 853. After hearing Hui Chaosher's explanation, Su Lu, who had just regained his composure for less than half a minute, fell into shock again. For words of disbelief appeared in his mind. Tai Ziyuan had obtained the support of the three industrial unions and the Veterans Association? This was impossible. The reason why Pabre could grow from a miner's son with no background to today's powerful president of the Federation was not only because of the group of geniuses from the Trinity Association in the tavern, but also because before he entered the political arena, he had already obtained the full support of the three industrial unions and the Veterans Association. He had an extremely wide base of public opinion among the people at the bottom of the Federation. Sulu had left the Federation for less than 3 years. He could not imagine how Tai Ziyuan could have Pabre's most staunch supporter in his hands. The more troublesome problem was that Tai Ziyuan was the crown prince of the back mountain of Macho. His life experience and identity were destined to be far apart from those poor workers and angry veterans. They were even naturally irreconcilable. I know my friend. Since he claims to have the support of the three industrial unions and the Veterans Association, then it must be true. Although I don't understand how he did it. After thinking silently for a moment, Sulu raised his head to look at Hui Chaosher and asked his concern, but as long as the government tells the people who he is, this support will collapse in an instant. Hui Chaosher looked at him calmly and said, "In fact, Tai Ziyuan has already admitted who he is. As for the people, the method he used to appease or buy the people, even His Majesty felt that it was unprecedented in history." Sulu looked at her in confusion. He could not imagine what kind of big move Tai Ziyuan had made to be able to achieve successive victories in the field that Pabre was best at, even alarming the Emperor of the Empire. On the southern plains of the S2 capital ring of the Federation, there was a small town called Woodstock. Because it was far away from Green Dragon Mountain, this small town had not experienced too many baptisms of war and death. The buildings still maintained a clean and old appearance. With the increasing number of retired workers and unemployed youths, the size of the small town grew larger and larger. The people who were bored and relied on social welfare to get by released their energy to operate heavy machinery in other places. For example, the sound of metal barrels that were like bombs, or the hoarse sound of cheap instruments that were like shouts. Gradually, this small town became the gathering place of the S2 underground music scene. It was summer, and the town was filled with ear-piercing music and screams. The 170,000 young people who participated in the Woodstock Music Festival were wearing simple or revealing clothes. They twisted their bodies and waved their arms excitedly, surrounding the town like a spreading sea of weeds. Under the combined effect of alcohol and hormones, the revelers were almost crazy. Some people even tried to push down the electronic wall in the depths of the grassland, triggering the sound of sirens. On the somewhat simple and crude central stage, a few thin men in dark night makeup held various kinds of instruments, madly shaking their heads, shaking their waists and buttocks, forcing out sharp screams from their shriveled bodies. Along with the rhythm of the drums and the heavy instruments, wave after wave attacked the eardrums of more than 100,000 people, evoking endless pain and the pleasure that pain brought. Fuck your mother. Pabre. Fuck your mother. Li Jadu. Fuck your mother. Fuck my mother. This was the Federation's most famous underground band, Second-Hand Guns. It had always been a selling point of violence and death. Because of its poor consciousness, this underground band had always been excluded by the Federation and the mainstream media. However, relying on the transmission of the internet and rumors, it still received the support and even crazy infatuation of countless rebellious youths. This time, the Woodstock Music Festival invited them to perform, which naturally made the already crazy scene even crazier. The band's lead singer shouted the most violent words in a hoarse voice. The drummer held the drum like a soldier holding a gun and did not let go. The front and back of the stage fell into a deathly silence. Suddenly, the enchanting male lead singer's eyes widened like a dead fish. He jumped up high and then fell down heavily. Because of the drugs, his skinny body did not stir up the slightest bit of dust. His pointed leather boots squeaked like a mouse. He was like a little boy begging for money as he handed out his painting tube to the sea of people. Like a bad actor, he frowned and screamed miserably, "Fuck you motherfucker." After the 3 words were forced out of his gray lips, there was no follow-up. There was only dead silence and a stalemate. It was not known whether it was 2 seconds or 3 seconds. More than 100,000 people under the stage broke out a strong response. It was like the mountains were howling, the sea was howling, and all the patients on the 7th floor of a mental hospital were laughing together. Pabre. The male lead singer of Second-Hand Guns nervously took back the microphone. He opened his mouth, revealing a mouthful of extremely ugly teeth eroded by drugs. Suddenly, he opened his eyes again and screamed, "Fuck your mother." Then it stopped. Not too long, maybe just a moment. Under the stage, there was an extremely violent response in the grassland around the town. Lee J-Do. Below the interstate highway on the edge of the town of Wood Todd, there was a temporary settlement. Under the ground of what looked like an extremely ordinary tourist convoy, there were countless cables shuttling between them. From time to time, young men and women wearing headbands and making peace and stupidity hand signs walked past with their arms around their waists and kissing as they headed to the town. After getting high with each other, no one noticed that in the gray carriages by the roadside, there were countless staff members working nonstop. In dark green uniforms with beautiful and exquisite badges inserted on the left side of their chests, young, beautiful, and enthusiastic female staff members were answering hotlines from all over the Federation. As the frontline staff of the headquarters of the Silent March, they were asked not to disappoint anyone who expressed their willingness to support. As for those who did not support, the phone could always be cut off. In the large carriage in the middle of the temporary settlement, the number of people in charge of answering the phone was much fewer. The call button rang and went off from time to time. The staff members politely and without humility responded to the other party's call request, "Yes, Mr. Senator, thank you very much for your support." On the grass outside the carriage, a thin young man was smoking. From his clothes and temperament, it was clear that he was different from all the staff members. 5 staff members were carefully protecting him from several meters away. A female secretary holding an electronic folder quickly walked to his side and said with uncontrollable excitement, "Mr. Senator, Songtao Resort Company is willing to bear the responsibility of transporting 4,000 protesters." Tai Ziyuan turned to look at her and asked calmly, "When will the reporters arrive?" The female secretary hesitated and said, "Those people don't have good intentions." Tai Ziyuan was silent for a moment, then said with a smile, "Ask them to come over. Although I don't have good intentions, I have to put on a show." Chapter 854. A wildfire was burning beside the town, and the revelry of the crowd was still going on. The air was filled with the strange smell of alcohol and massed flowers. On the east side of the temporary camp, Tai Ziyuan and his assistant were surrounded by more than a dozen reporters from the major media of the Federation. The first question he faced was extremely direct. "Mr. Senator, what is your purpose?" Tai Ziyuan's expression was calm, and his answer was even more direct. "My purpose is very simple. I want to tell the whole Federation that President Pabre and his government have been abandoned. But don't forget that the president and the government were elected by the voters. We want to tell the voters who voted in the election through this silent march that you are wrong. Do we have to wait for 2.5 years to correct this terrible mistake? Regarding your accusation against Mr. President and the relevant departments of the government, there is no convincing evidence. Collecting and confirming evidence should be the work of the Ministry of Justice or the prosecutor's office." The middle-aged reporter's reaction became fierce, and he loudly protested, "Telling the truth without evidence is tantamount to slandering." A blush suddenly appeared on Lai Ziyuan's pale and thin cheeks. It wasn't because of excitement or anger, but because of thick mockery. He calmly looked at the reporter, and after a moment, he smiled and said, "You're a reporter from the Post. Don't tell me you didn't receive the electronic document sent by my office? I don't believe that you haven't read the summary of doubts about the background investigation of the antique bell and related cases. In that case, how dare you use the word slandering, to slander me?" Without waiting for the reporter to respond, he looked at the reporters around him with a blank face, raised his right hand to stop the reporter from asking, and said in a deep voice, "If you want evidence, go back to your own newspaper or the chief editor's office. As early as 2 weeks ago, I have submitted these things to the Ministry of Justice and you. What I am very confused about is, why didn't I see these contents in any newspaper or TV screen? I very much welcome President Pabre to accuse me of this crime. Slander is a private prosecution case. As a lawyer, he should know that he can't arrange for the Ministry of Justice to arrest me directly. Then, I will have the opportunity to debate with Mr. President face to face in court. I only hope that he won't back down." The press conference next to the temporary camp had fallen into a tense, or perhaps panicked, silence. The reporters looked at the youngest district councillor in the history of the Federation, not knowing what to say for a moment. Still, it was the reporter from the Post who began to ask questions. "Rumor has it that 7 families have been hiding behind the curtain, secretly ruling the Federation. They are the so-called 7 great families. Councillor Feng, you're the only successor of the Tai family, and Feng is the surname of the previous dynasty. Tai Ziyuan looked at the reporter, raised his index finger and said, "Is this news? Or do you think this is the focus of the report? What does the stories of tens of thousands of years ago have to do with the Federation that we care about today? But as far as I know, when you were growing up, a lot of people called you Crown Prince." The Post reporter retorted without backing down, and there was a hint of malicious speculation. "I can't stop others from calling me what they want. At the same time, what kind of person I am will not change because of a name." Tai Ziyuan was still calm. He spread out his hands and said to the reporters, "If you like, you can also call me that." At this time, dozens of drunk young men and women walked past the outside of the camp. They were holding wine bottles, dragging their feet unsteadily, and excitedly waving their arms in the direction of the press conference. They shouted in a high-pitched voice, "Crown Prince. We support you." After the strange screams, whistles, cheers, and even the rolling curses, the press conference fell into a short, strange silence. The Post reporter frowned deeply, raised his face slightly, looked at Tai Ziyuan, and continued to ask, "You want to become the president of the Federation? You are still seeking benefits for your family. Become the youngest president in the history of the Federation? Why not?" Tai Ziyuan frowned sharply, looked at him sternly, and said, "If I can do better than Pabre, why can't I become the president? As for benefits, what kind of benefits are benefits? To seize more economic benefits for the family through politics? If you think so, I can repeat what I said at the press conference 2 weeks ago." He looked around at the reporters and staff, leaned forward slightly, and his pale face was full of undeniable determination. He said, "As long as President Pabre gives up on changing the election law, resigns, and accepts the investigation of the related charges, I, Tai Ziyuan, will give up the right to inherit the Federation of Crystal Mines and the Xiao Shu Foundation." What was the most valuable resource in the Federation? It was crystal mines. What was the most important resource in the Federation? It was crystal mines. In the great era of the universe, human society could not live without crystal mines. In a sense, crystal mines were a more indispensable social foundation than food. For crystal mines, the Federation in the early years did not hesitate to spend a lot of manpower and resources to go to the borderline star zone. They blew up a companion moon, destroyed a fleet, and buried tens of thousands of lives. Finally, they succeeded in establishing a crystal mine base in the East Forest. And today, the Federation did not hesitate to go to war with the powerful empire for crystal mines. They wanted to go deep into the left sky star zone and control the few inconspicuous mining planets in the Galaxy X. It was obvious how important crystal mines were. Tens of thousands of years ago, the Tai dynasty peacefully abdicated, and the Republic began. According to the agreement, Macho Back Mountain had all the rights to the extraction and refinement of all the crystal mines of the Federation. Relying on this privilege, the former royal family, which was sparsely populated, quietly accumulated a terrifying amount of wealth that surpassed the Iron Scheming family. They had always been the leader of the 7 families and could sit on equal footing with the government of the Federation. It could even be said that they had always held the lifeline of the Federation. Until the strong rise of Pabre's government, the government began to try to take back this privilege. But because of the influence of the Tai family, which had lasted for tens of thousands of years, the government did not dare to go too far. Once the Madam of Macho Back Mountain was truly angered, the entire Federation would be destroyed. No one would have thought that in the press conference 2 weeks ago, Tai Ziyuan, the only successor of Macho Back Mountain, would announce to the entire universe that he would personally excavate this lifeline of the Federation, the most solid foundation for the survival of the family, and return it to the people of the Federation with both hands. Whether it was the strength of the impact or the depth of the impact, Tai Ziyuan's shocking decision could not be compared to a normal donation. This donation would directly lead to a fundamental change in the political structure of the Federation's shadow. It could also be said that he had tied a black noose around his neck. This was a huge move that even the master of the left sky starfield, the emperor of the empire, was shocked by. This kind of move had never been seen in history books, and had never even appeared in fantasy dramas. The government of the Federation, the imperial family of the empire, could all do this? Who would have thought? Chapter 855. In that sensational press conference that would definitely leave a stirring memory in history, the young senator Shi Ziyuan clearly explained his thoughts with a calmness and indifference that was completely inconsistent with his age and the events that transpired. The Federation of Crystal Mines and the Xiao Shu Foundation would be owned by all the citizens of the Federation based on the Shell business model. They would be jointly managed by the Parliament, the government, and the relevant funds. He would also distribute the dividends of the first 500 years of the Federation of Crystal Mines. According to simple mathematical calculations, every citizen of the Federation would receive more than 500,000 in exchangeable notes. It was truly an unbelievable number. Of course, in order to ensure that the financial system and the economic structure of the Federation would not be severely impacted, the profit redistribution plan would be carefully arranged by the top accountants of the Sanlin Union Bank and the mathematicians of the Capital University. The preliminary plan that the government and the Parliament had received was already particularly complicated and lengthy. Most of the reporters in the outskirts of Woodward had participated in the press conference 2 weeks ago. When they heard it again today, they still found it hard to control their shock. They looked at the skinny young counselor on the stage with a complicated expression, unable to understand his true thoughts. In the silence, Tai Ziyuan opened his mouth again. I appreciate President Pabre's efforts to eliminate social injustice and class conflict, but I don't appreciate his methods. It's true that I am the heir of the so-called big family that you mentioned, but I believe that the entire Federation should know my attitude. If the innate wealth that comes with a family background is a sin, I've already given it up. Then, no one is qualified to criticize or be vigilant against a sin that I haven't committed with my family background. That is a sin in itself. He slowly looked around at the reporters. Suddenly, he curled his lips and asked with a smile, do the rich and powerful commit all kinds of evil? Have I done it? Who here can say that I've done a single evil thing in my life? Leading the Federation does not require you to be a perfect moral person, but you should at least refrain from doing evil. From this point of view, I believe that I am indeed more qualified to be the president of the Federation than Mr. Pabre. The reporter retorted angrily, you are just looking for fame. You know very well that the president and the Federation government will never agree to your 3 demands. You selectively ignored some important points again. Tai Ziyuan's eyes were slightly cold. He stared sharply at the excited middle-aged reporter and said in a deep voice, I also said that as long as the High Court's ruling on the right of inheritance takes effect, the above promise will be carried out immediately. I will donate all the assets that should be donated. Even so, this can only be seen as buying the people. Another reporter could not help but raise his hand and say, Representative Feng, don't you think that such a bribe is an insult to the people of the Federation? If I'm seeking fame, then I'm willing for everyone in the Federation to seek fame like me, as long as it can bring benefits to others. After Tai Ziyuan said this to the reporter, he turned to another reporter and said, if this is a bribe, then this is an insult. I believe that the people will welcome others to insult them every day. I also welcome it. But this is war time. The reporter retorted angrily, at this time, you are helping the people of the Empire by inciting hatred between different classes and inciting internal strife within the Federation. The reporter followed this topic and said mockingly, if this was still during the reign of the Empire, Mr. Representative, you would definitely be hanged for treason. Treason? Hearing this comment, Tai Ziyuan, who had been calm enough all this time, narrowed his eyes. He spoke faster and faster, spewing out like cold raindrops, the Federation attacked the Empire to punish the invaders. How many people died in the Empire? Is the punishment enough? I know that many people may say that it is not enough, but how many people have to die for it to be enough? Kill all the people of the Empire? Do you think that the people of the Empire are slow-moving logs in the forest waiting for you to chop them down? He looked at the reporters around him and said coldly, there are more than 100 billion people of the Empire. You can go and ask Mr. President if he dares to dream of fully occupying the Empire. If he doesn't even dare to dream of this, then how long is he prepared to fight this war? How long will the Federation's withering economic system continue to bear? I really want to ask him, what is the reason for the start of this war and what is the ultimate goal? Is it to seize the crystal mine or for some other unspeakable purpose? These words aroused the anger of even more reporters. In their eyes, this young representative's words were not only questioning Mr. President, but also questioning the justice of the Federation's war. They could not accept this at all. Then, before they could protest in excitement, Tai Ziyuan raised his right arm and continued with a cold expression, in a just war, many ugly things have been done in your name. You don't have to rush to accuse me of treason or being a capitulator. Back then, when I was fighting against the people of the Empire in the West Woods, where were Mr. President and all of you? Whether it is a war or a violent revolution, people will die. Tai Ziyuan's emotions suddenly became extremely calm. There was a faint feeling in his indifferent eyes as he looked at the crowd and said, are you prepared to die? In other words, are you prepared to die? And not incite others to die. The impromptu press conference in the town of Woodend ended, and the reporters dispersed. No one knew what kind of report would be released tomorrow. No one knew what kind of point of view those reporters with ugly expressions would take from Tai Ziyuan's words today and twist them into to make the people angry. Tai Ziyuan was not in the mood to pay attention to this. He stood in the deep night, in the weeds that reached his knees. Suddenly, he began to cough violently. He coughed until his face was pale, and his thin body could not help but bend down. He took out a white silk handkerchief from his pocket and covered his mouth. He stood up with great difficulty and took the pills from Bai Qi behind him. He expressed his gratitude with a smile. Reporter Wood did not leave. He watched Tai Ziyuan finish taking the pills before walking over. After a moment of silence, he frowned and asked, "Mr. Senator, why did you do this?" To be fair, Tai Ziyuan's answer was very quick. It was like a mechanical answer every time he was interviewed. Then, he smiled and looked at Wood. "Do you believe me?" Wood did not shake his head or nod. He looked at the dark town and listened to the faint sound of the last music in the distance. He said, "The smell of massed flowers in the air should be the smell of sex. There are about a few thousand abandoned condoms in the meadow in front of us. Are these people the heroes you want to rely on to fight against the government?" Schiller said that heroes also need to eat, sleep, and have sex, Tai Ziyuan said. Everyone can become a hero at a certain time. So you want to use them. They are used to being used. You are buying them. The people can never be persuaded, they can only be bought. This has long been proven by history. Wood shook his head disapprovingly and said, "You have not shaken the foundation of Mr. President's public opinion. The government has a lot of resources. After this silent march enters S1, it will encounter great difficulties. So, the chief editor and I don't understand why you are in such a hurry to make a move at this time." Tai Ziyuan was silent for a long time before suddenly saying, "If we don't act quickly, it will be dark soon." After a pause, he said, "If we don't act quickly, it will be dawn." Chapter 856. Just now, you said that a raging revolution is not desirable. Then, have you ever thought that the silent march will definitely become intense because of anger and blood in the end? Just like the youth army protests in Medellin years ago, this kind of collective unconscious public carnival is completely uncontrollable. It will inevitably lead to social unrest and the dark picture of blood and death. Reporter Wood looked at Tai Ziyuan and said with a serious expression, "What is even more frightening is that even if we pay such a huge price, the future that the Federation will usher in may not be better." After a long silence, Tai Ziyuan turned to look at him calmly and said, "I don't care." Wood frowned and looked at him in disbelief. He asked, "Then what do you care?" Tai Ziyuan smiled and did not directly answer the question. His thin eyebrows raised slightly and he said, "If it were that guy, he probably wouldn't do what I do. He would directly carry a gun and kill his way into the president's official residence. The problem is that I don't have his abnormal ability." Wood knew who he was talking about and shook his head with a bitter smile. The night after the carnival was so tiring. The men and women in the long meadow fell asleep with wine bottles in their arms. Their thighs were haphazardly placed together, and their hands were unconsciously rubbing something. Probably because of the emptiness, as the first ray of white willow light penetrated the thin layer of clouds in the east and shone on those dazzling white thighs full of youthful decadence, the whole world woke up. It seemed that there was no organization, but in fact, there were many people organizing. The carnival crowd washed away their fatigue and frustration. At dawn, they put on black masks that symbolized the night and waved the signs they had prepared. Riding on the heavy trucks provided by the three major unions, they left the messy town of Woodend and gathered at the airport of Oak State. Their goal was S1, the capital, and Charter Square. When the Federation government first put Sulu on the wanted list, many students protested in the streets. At that time, those students wore black masks on their faces, just like today. However, in this battle, Sulu, who was far away in the empire, probably could not participate. In the simple library where light and dust danced together, Sulu rested his chin on the table. He was silent for a long time before he could digest the story told by Huai Chaoshi. He was shocked by his friend's bold action, but he was confused about the turmoil that was happening in his hometown. Our intelligence work in the Federation is basically zero, but these are all things that can be seen in the news. As for the reaction of the lady in the back mountain, we can roughly guess. Although the government of the Federation has always been trying to infiltrate the Crystal Federation, I believe that the madam has enough methods to ensure the interests of her family. Who would have thought that her only son would actually dig out the most important foundation of the Tai family? The Crystal Mining Federation and the Xiao Shu Foundation are much more important than a single president of the Federation. Huai Chaoshi looked at the tea in her cup and said calmly, "I'm saying all this to tell you that the war on planet Mohua will probably have a period of stability, but I don't want it to. Therefore, I will take this opportunity to lead the troops to launch a counterattack and chase the Federation forces out." If the Federation government moved Du Shaoqing and the elite troops from the front lines back to the capital ring to deal with the increasingly intense and complicated internal situation, the Empire would naturally obtain a rare opportunity. The problem was that the new 17th Division would probably still be left on planet Mo. Thinking of his former comrades who were about to face the crazy counterattack of the Empire's troops, the veins on Su Li's forehead suddenly popped. He licked his bitter lips and looked up at Huai Chaosher. "You're not worried that I will tell the Federation about your deployment? It's useless even if you say it. Furthermore, I know very well what kind of person you are." Huai Chaosher looked at him and said calmly, "When I return to Mo, I hope that you will return to planet Tianjing to take a look at him. After all, he is our biological father." Su Lu was silent for a moment before saying, "Back then, when he whipped me in the palace, he did not recognize me. Since that's the case, it's better not to acknowledge him. To be honest, I can now accept that you are my biological sister, but I still find it hard to imagine that the master of the left Sky Star region, the supreme emperor of the Empire, would be my father. In my heart, my father has already died in the Donglin mine disaster. His name is Su Shukai." Huai Chaosher slowly narrowed her eyes, and there was a faint hint of fury brewing in her eyes. However, in the end, it silently dissipated, leaving behind only a stretch of tranquility. "I will go to planet Tianjing." Su Lu looked at her and said, "According to what you said, the mother who gave birth to me was an ordinary female official in the palace. In that case, I would like to go to her grave to take a look." Huai Chaosher took out a small electronic token from the pocket of her military uniform and pushed it in front of him. "Then," she said, "I've already told you the location. If you run into any trouble on planet Tianjing, just take this electronic token and reveal your identity." Su Lu frowned in confusion. He used his fingertips to pick up the small electronic token and asked, "What is this?" Huai Chaosher did not directly answer his question. Instead, she said, "The reason why the Military Intelligence Bureau can keep track of your whereabouts is very simple. It's just like the reason why you were discovered after you left Donglin all those years ago. When you see something unfair, you can't help but want to stand up for it, even at the expense of exposing your tracks. A person like you is completely unsuited to escape. Since you say that this has nothing to do with justice, and that fighting for justice is purely your favorite hobby, then it will be more convenient to have an official title." After a slight pause, she continued, "All the departments in the Military Intelligence Bureau have received the relevant documents. You have been appointed as a special patrol and have the same level of authority as me. In the future, when you want to engage in such leisure activities, please don't hesitate. Although you don't need the help of those officials, they are better at things like destroying corpses, destroying evidence, and framing others." Su Lu quietly looked at the electronic token at his fingertips, not knowing what to say. Such an important appointment would definitely have received the tacit approval of the emperor in Jiaxing Hall. However, the greater the enthusiasm and expectations of the empire's royal family, the greater the pressure he felt. This invisible pressure caused him to straddle the two sides of Jelly Corridor, not knowing where to go. He did not even dare to have any contact with either side, as that would be extremely unfair to the other side. Therefore, he could only remain silent. Killing people is a small matter. Your behavior pattern is what you think is interesting. However, I feel that it is very inappropriate for that young lady to keep following you. Chapter 857. As he grew older, Su Lu was as cheerful and optimistic as he had been in his youth, but he spoke less and less. He was no longer as eloquent and crafty as he had been yesterday. It was probably due to some kind of genetic instinct. His sister, Huai Chaosher, was naturally not a person who was good at chatting. Usually, she would only talk about things as they were, simply and directly, and even crudely, put forward her arguments. So when she suddenly threw out this question in the latter part of the conversation, Su Lu was stunned for a long time before he reacted. He scratched his head and answered, "This girl will lead the people of the West Woods in the future, at least on a spiritual level, so she must learn to be strong. This is what I think is the right way to educate her. As for those questions, I am not worried. Very few people know that I started killing people when I was 12. I grew up in the cruelest environment in the Federation and saw too many dirty and dark killings. I think that only by seeing too many of these can one understand the value of certain things." Huai Chaosher frowned slightly. Looking at the warm sunlight on his face, she didn't know if it was because she felt sorry for her younger brother's tragic childhood in Donglin or because she thought of something else. After a short pause, she shook her head and said, "People like you are rare. After seeing too many dark scenes, it doesn't necessarily make people yearn for the sun. It's like a pool of unbearably smelly mud. White lotus may grow, but more often, maggots and rotting creatures are cultivated." Sulu thought that this was a very good analogy. He didn't know how to refute it, so he smiled and drank the cold tea in his cup. His mood was still calm. That little girl was his child, and only he could be sure how to accompany her as she grew up. Next to the shabby library was a shabby classroom. Most of the chairs in the room had been taken by the students as weapons against the Imperial Military Intelligence Agency, so it seemed a little empty. Zhong Huayan, who had grown into a beautiful girl, leaned against the window. Using the clear light coming in from outside, she looked at a small mirror and carefully trimmed the hair in front of her forehead. The scissors were extremely sharp and cold. Her hair, which had been coarsely dyed light brown by the town's female hairdresser, was cut off by the sharp blade. Staring at the sharp scissors, the girl's eyes did not blink. She was unusually calm, allowing the fine strands of hair to slowly fall to the ground. In front of her, there was an old man with white powder on his face. He looked kind and amiable. He was saying something in a low voice. The kindness in his eyes was strange. His attitude was very humble, but occasionally, there would be a trace of arrogance in his eyes that only a real big shot could have. This old man was the deputy director of the Imperial Palace. No matter where he appeared, he would be greeted with infinite respect. Even the powerful governor of the empire had to habitually flatter him. However, no matter how humble his attitude was and how soft his voice was, Zhong Huayan did not respond. She just calmly tidied her hair and did not even look at him. Could it be that you don't like the identity of the little princess? No matter where you appear, you will have the supreme glory of being one of the top 3 people in the empire. No one will dare to oppose you, and no one will dare to go against your will. In the eyes of the old deputy general manager, Zhong Huayan was just an ignorant young girl. He suppressed the unhappiness in his heart and persuaded with a smile, "Young commandery princess, you should persuade His Highness to return to the palace. Only in this way, you don't have to run around like you are now. You can enjoy the beautiful life that I just mentioned." Hearing this, Zhong Huayan finally reacted. She gently put down the sharp scissors in her hand and calmly looked at the director of the imperial palace. She said, "Since the day I was born, I have always been called the little princess. Do you think I care about the title of princess?" The deputy director smiled awkwardly and said, "How can a corner of the West Woods be compared to the vast empire?" Zhong Huayan narrowed her eyes and smiled innocently like a little white rabbit on the 2 moons. She shrugged and suddenly said in a cold tone, "When has your empire ever defeated our West Woods?" The most luxurious restaurant on the top floor of Mulberry's state government had been booked. Now that the rebellion in the empire had been quelled, the nobles who booked the restaurant no longer had to worry about the bullets coming from afar. In the light music, the sound of silver forks rubbing against porcelain plates echoed. Zhong Huayan opened her clear and bright eyes and looked curiously at the woman beside her brother. Although that woman was her brother's sister, she was not going to call her sister. Although she had never seen her before, she knew very well what kind of power this extraordinarily ordinary woman, who wore the Empire's military uniform and did not look like a woman, had in this universe. How does it feel to be the strongest woman? She put down the knife and fork in her hand and looked at Huai Chaoshi and asked very seriously, "No matter how strong a woman is, she will have to marry in the future. What should we do in that case?" This was a very abrupt and even somewhat impolite question, but Huai Chaoshi did not express any displeasure. Instead, she sank into a long silence, as if seriously considering the answer. Sulu was not used to this kind of atmosphere. He drank a mouthful of orange juice and looked at Huai Chaoshi and asked, "You will have to marry in the end." Because of his words, Huai Chaoshi easily found the answer. She looked at him expressionlessly and said, "If you are willing to return to the palace, I will naturally marry. But if you don't return to the palace, I will inherit the throne. How will I marry? Who dares to marry a female emperor? Oh, my creator." Zhong Huayan's fingers lifted the hair in front of her forehead and sighed helplessly. "Your Royal Highness, can you not always put pressure on Brother Sulu?" Huai Chaoshi looked at her and asked, "What about you? What kind of person do you want to be in the future?" "In the future, I will have to return to the West Woods." Zhong Huayan glanced at Sulu and turned her head with a smile. "I want to integrate the power of the West Woods and complete my revenge on the Federation government. I want to kill Pabre and Li Jiedu. Then, depending on my mood, maybe I will think of a way to make the West Woods independent." A 15-year-old girl, calmly speaking of her life's ideals amidst the gentle music. Such a strange and terrifying life ideal was a very strange scene. But whether it was Sulu or Huai Chaoshi, they did not think that this was a child's nonsense. Because she was the little princess of the West Woods, there were still countless people of the West Woods who were loyal to her. In addition to Su Li's relationship with many more people, these ideals were not necessarily far away. After a long silence, Huai Chaoshu gently wiped the corner of her mouth and looked at Sulu with a faint smile. This is the result of your education. This was the first time Sulu had heard the little watermelon's inner thoughts. He roughly understood that this was her true desire after seeing Huai Chaoshu, the most powerful woman in the universe. For a moment, he was speechless. But I welcome it. Huai Chaoshu looked at the girl and said calmly, on behalf of the Empire, I welcome your great idea of making the West Woods independent. Chapter 858. You wouldn't know if you didn't hear it. The world was really wonderful. Once you heard it, you would discover that some layers of the world had suddenly collapsed and shattered into grotesque fragments that couldn't be reformed in a short period of time. Sulu couldn't react to Huai Chaoshu's rather meaningful welcome speech for the future. He only suddenly remembered how Mr. Tian complained to him in the West Woods that he couldn't be a good father. Then he understood that he was indeed not cut out to be a father. He watched as this 5-year-old girl who hugged a doll and wore pajamas turned into a 15-year-old girl who wandered among the stars. He had never sensed what she was thinking in her heart, and he had never sensed that there was actually such a majestic burning ambition in her body that was gradually becoming youthful and beautiful. Holding half a cup of orange juice tightly, Sulu looked at Zhong Huiyan's face. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but he seemed to see the tiger that had once dominated a corner of the universe, whose supreme domineering aura was contained in its thin body. This father and daughter pair didn't look alike, and neither did their temperaments. However, the boldness and temperament in their bones that dared to destroy the world with a wave of their hands seemed to have been carved from the same mold. Like those uncles in the Federation who hugged a human-shaped pillow and cried when they saw Jian Shuai return, they found that the little girl beside them had suddenly grown up overnight and was about to have her own independent life. She would leave her own wings and stubbornly leave home to come into contact with her own world. She might meet some extremely good or extremely bad little boys. Suli's mood suddenly became gloomy, and he even felt a little depressed. He basically spent the second half of this luxurious lunch in Mulberry-ji state capital in this mood. He appeared to be more silent than usual. He completely didn't notice that Zhong Huiyan opened her big innocent eyes and was continuously expressing her worship and respect to the princess of the empire. Naturally, he also didn't hear Huai Chaoshu very generously talk about her childhood and her struggles related to power. After Huai Chaoshu finished recuperating, she had to return to Mo Hua planet to preside over the next stage of the military operation. She didn't ask where Sulu was going. She just narrowed her cold eyes and forced Sulu to leave the most reliable contact information. Then they parted ways. A light black spaceship took off at high speed in the vast sea of mulberry trees of planet Lispan. Half a minute later, the anti-air defense system of planet Lispan caught a trace of the spaceship, but before they could set up the missile launch, they received a strict order from the upper echelons of the military forbidding them to continue tracking. The black spaceship without any markings broke through the atmosphere at an unimaginable speed. Following the gaps in the Empire's surveillance network, it disappeared into space in the blink of an eye. In fact, it had already quietly arrived at the shadow of the Liban Galaxy's sailor planet under the cover of the meteorite belt. Behind the shadow of the planet, there was a thicker and deeper shadow. Only when one was close enough, with the naked eye or the most advanced equipment, could they see the thick shadow. It turned out to be an incomparably huge broken spaceship. The exterior of the spaceship was painted in an uneven shade of black. All kinds of cabin components were piled up outside in a mess, like a huge space garbage dump. After countless self-modifications, the Federation's tri-winged spaceship was no longer the same as it used to be. There were also some subtle changes to its appearance when it was rushing wildly in the sky of the S1 ocean. Those hollow cabins were densely facing the external environment like a beehive, which could perfectly absorb all kinds of detection waves. As for its appearance, it was still as clumsy and rough as before, exuding a sense of horror. It could only be said that the non-human designer was too preoccupied with overthrowing human aviation design to satisfy his vanity and completely forgot what beauty was. When the cabin door was pushed open, the dim central control room suddenly lit up with environmental lights that were absolutely the best for the human eye. Sulu still couldn't help but squint his eyes. He didn't feel very comfortable. Zhong Huiyan, who was obediently holding on to his sleeve and silently following behind, also squinted her eyes. She seemed to be uncomfortable as well. After leaving Shanghai, the two of them didn't speak and maintained absolute silence. This silence came from a very complicated reason that couldn't be explained clearly, so they had to keep quiet. However, this tri-winged spaceship was never a silent home. When they were wandering among the stars, Sulu and Little Watermelon would sometimes be angry, and sometimes throw tantrums. It was common for them to be silent for a day and a night. However, that guy definitely didn't have this problem. He always played the role of a perfect chatterbox. Wahahaha. I've said it before. In the entire universe, except for that broken computer in the Bureau of Proclamation, no one is better at biology than me. Who am I? I'm a great unknown existence. I can make something as complicated as protein meat, so why can't I make silk? My two partners, I have good news for you. Just 3 hours ago, I've successfully developed artificial silk. According to the type of energy consumption and equivalent calculation, we only need to randomly pick a small mineral planet with oil, and we can monopolize the silk industry in the entire universe. On that day, whether it's the nobles of Sangji or the smugglers of Bermuda, they will all have to kneel at our feet, crying and begging us to give them a bowl of rice. By then, how powerful will we be? The voice in the central control room reverberated excitedly. Several hydraulic mechanical arms swayed back and forth in front of Sulu as if they were dancing. He said softly, "What does this mean?" "This means science and technology. Only science and technology are the primary productive forces." Sulu and Zhonghuayan returned to their seats. One big and one small, like two very similar statues, propped up their chins and stared blankly at the dark universe outside the window. They didn't pay attention to that guy's madness. In fact, in the past 3 years, although he didn't have the support of the central database of the Federation, that guy still continued to come up with new tricks. As his only audience, they had long been numb. "Lulu, Lulu, Lulu, what's wrong with you?" The slender mechanical arm made a beautiful circle in the air and moved closer to Su Li's eyebrows. He asked curiously, "Have you been beaten silly by your sister Shi Jiafa?" Sulu frowned and said, "I've told you many times, don't call me Lulu." Zhonghuayan said sarcastically, "She thinks she'll sound cuter if she calls you that." Student Philip became angry and asked, "What's wrong with the name Lulu? When Mr. Shi went to have one-night stands with those women, he always used my name and insisted that those women call him Lulu in bed." Sulu spread out his hands and said seriously, "Is this reason good enough? Then what do you want me to call you? Master? Prince? I used to call you Colonel Sulu, but you're no longer a colonel of the Federation. You're not even Sulu. Who are you?" Philip was as agitated as a philosopher who had been beaten by his wife. He protested, "No one knows your name. Do you want me to call you Huailu? How many months have you been pregnant? Why don't I know?" Zhonghuayan heard someone viciously attacking her most respected and beloved brother. She finally couldn't hold it in anymore. She slammed her small hand on the table and twisted her tender waist. She said angrily, "Then what should we call you?" "My dearest Xiao Fei, bullshit. You don't have parents, so how can you give yourself a name? The first person a chick sees after pecking open the eggshell is its parents. You should take brother Su Li's surname." Chapter 859. A man, a girl, and a computer life that had always insisted that it did not have a gender, had been drifting among the stars in a broken spaceship for nearly 3 years. In the past 3 years, they had been to many places and met many people. But in the end, they could only brush their sleeves and leave like a dragonfly on the surface of the water, not leaving too many traces. Most of the time, only the 3 of them were alone in the cockpit. Life was unavoidably boring, to the point of incessantly attacking each other, and the content was often simply revolving around the various naming rights childishly. For example, why was the MXT mecha that had once accompanied Sulu to shock the world called Little White Flower? Why was Luchio's name so sour? Was there a need to add Shangchio's name? Even the black, broken spaceship they were in did not have an official name. The reason for this was because the 3 of them felt that the matter of names was very important. The reason why they felt that names were important was probably because, whether it was Sulu, who was struggling between the Empire and the Federation, Philip, who was struggling between the cold computer and intelligent life, or Zhonghuayan, who was struggling between the identity of a princess of the West Woods and a little watermelon who followed her brother to wander, they were all people who lacked a stable sense of belonging. They needed to use names, which were simple code names in the eyes of hipsters, to confirm their sense of belonging and increase their sense of security. After a moment of silence, Philip's voice once again rang out in the control room, delicate and proud. "I don't care about other things, but as the captain and the creator of this broken spaceship, I have decided to name it Black Straight." Zhonghuayan did not sarcastically mock him for being a mechanic, and directly said, "I object." Sulu did not say anything, only raising his right hand to show that he agreed with her opinion. Due to the simple democratic centralism of the trio, Philip's attempt to seize the naming rights once again suffered the heaviest blow. He angrily asked, "What's wrong with this name? It's too erotic." Zhonghuayan's expression was very serious. Sulu raised his right hand, but in fact, he did not pay attention to the quarrel around him. He was just habitually standing beside Zhong Huiyan in this kind of routine battle. One was an old thing who had lived for thousands of years, while the other was a little watermelon who had just turned into a young girl. It was not difficult to choose sides. At this time, he was thinking about other things. After getting rid of some of his previous gloomy mood, he naturally began to worry about his future life, mainly the life of the little girl. According to the information provided by Huai Chaosher, as well as the files that Philip occasionally obtained from invading the Federation's charter network, he knew that Mr. Tian had already left the front lines last year and was forced to return to the West Woods. This was a very normal thing. No matter how gentle Du Shaoqing's temperament was, as the commander-in-chief of the Federation's frontline enemies, it was impossible for him to allow a powerhouse without any scruples to call him an ice demoness without any military identity to command more than a dozen Shilin division under his command. Furthermore, this famous general of the Federation's temperament had never had anything to do with the word gentle. Since Uncle Tian has returned to the West Woods for a year, the situation there should be stable. After a long silence, Sulu looked into Zhong Huiyan's eyes and asked seriously, "Since you said that you want to return to the West Woods, then when will you return?" 10 years had passed, but in his eyes, the girl in front of him was still the pitiful little girl who had run away from home. This was the first time he had spoken to her in such a serious tone and in such an equal manner. Zhong Huiyan was obviously not used to it. She found that her brother was finally treating her like an adult. She was secretly happy and excited, but there was also panic and confusion that came out of nowhere. She nervously scratched her silk-like straight chestnut hair, tilted her head slightly, and asked tentatively, "After the coming-of-age ceremony? Going back after your 16th birthday?" Sulu confirmed seriously. His mood was a little complicated. Thinking that there was only 1 year left, he was a little reluctant, but thinking that the girl was growing up day by day in front of him, he was a little relieved. Zhong Huiyan anxiously waved her hands quickly and said anxiously, "No, isn't the coming-of-age ceremony at the age of 18? There were still 2 more years to go." Suli's mood became a lot better for no reason. He smiled and said with emotion, "Time is really a butcher's knife." Zhong Huiyan's eyes narrowed into crescents. She smiled sweetly and said, "It depends on whether you are a pig or a pearl. I can't be more real than a pearl. Our little princess is, of course, the most beautiful and dazzling pearl in the universe." Sulu laughed. Zhong Huiyan saw that the annoyance between his eyebrows had disappeared, and her heart seemed to be covered with a layer of the brightest sky blue. She giggled very happily. Philip had been silently watching the scene from the side with interest. When he saw that they were happy again, he couldn't help but bitterly comment, "What a pervert." "What did you say?" Sulu asked. "I said, why are you as stupid as a broken stone with no mouth when it comes to Jian Shuer, Shang Qiu, and Zhang Xiaoming, but when it comes to this little girl, you can sweet talk like this." Zhong Huiyan touched her light chestnut hair and angrily glared at the front of the mechanical arm. But at this time, her mood was too good. Her eyes were too clean, and her eyebrows were too beautiful. This action, in addition to being cute, also had a rare feminine look. It was not intimidating at all. Philip was too lazy to pay attention to her. He asked Sulu, "Where are we going next?" "I have some information that a big family in the Empire has a batch of primary alloy ore ready to be loaded into a smuggling spaceship. It is only 645.32 astronomical units away from us. We have no reason not to eat these things." In the library, in front of Huai Chaosher, Sulu had said that fighting for justice was his hobby. These words were somewhat shameless, but Philip had been doing shameless things all these years. Relying on the terrifying collision force of the broken spaceship's engine, he had unreasonably robbed every corner of the universe. Whether it was the private ships of the 7 families of the Federation, the spaceships of the merchants of Bermuda, or the spaceships of the nobles of the Empire, they were all his targets. In almost all the secret smuggling routes at both ends of the universe, the legend of a certain greedy demon echoed. Of course, Philip insisted that this was robbing the rich to help the poor. This was a reasonable distribution of resources. This was rearranging the laws of the Creator. As for the Creator's true intentions? Who cares? In a sense, he was the Creator. "Let's go to planet Tianjing." Suli's answer was clearly well thought out, so it came very quickly. The reason he came to the Empire was because he wanted to know where he was born, and Philip wanted to find the higher-level mechanical intelligence that they had talked about before. To achieve these 2 goals, they had to go to the planet with the strictest security in the Empire. He frowned, gently stroking the metal bracelet on his left wrist, and said, "If the disguise chip was removed from that spaceship, then the high-sequence mechanical intelligence you are looking for is very likely related to Master Fan Manor." "The possibility is as high as 99%, Philip replied. The Hua family's ancestor shouldn't be from the Empire, but from some ancestral planet. Sulu said, if the high-sequence mechanical intelligence came from that ancestral planet, and the Hua family didn't have the ability to fully grasp it, they could only drive a spaceship from that ancestral planet to the left sky star field. This can explain many of the problems, such as why there hasn't been an impressive existence like you in the Empire. I'm embarrassed by your praise, Philip replied softly. Without the support of the Federation's central database, I'm not as impressive as before. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Sulu ignored this guy's seemingly humble but narcissistic tone and asked directly, the question now is, where is the ancestral planet? What is it? Although I don't have the support of the central database, of course I remember such an important thing very clearly. Philip's voice suddenly became calm, as if talking about this matter made him feel a little heavy. According to the inference of the scholars on both sides, the Federation and the Empire share the same origin, so the Empire's ancestral planet must be Earth. Earth? Sulu furrowed his brows and asked, isn't this name a little too unpleasant to hear? Zhong Huiyan cautiously reminded him, brother, you are back to your habit of criticizing. You have to know that we have no right or qualification to participate in the naming of that ancestral planet. The slender metal mechanical arm shook up and down, indicating that it nodded in agreement. Sulu felt a little embarrassed, coughing twice before continuing to ask, why have I never heard of Earth when I was in the Federation? Because this is all top-secret information before the catastrophe, Philip said in a serious tone. Even if you have the authority of the 5th or 6th floor, I can't open up this information to you unless the 5-man team is reborn and removes the restrictions in the core program. Then why are you telling me today? Philip explained in a frivolous tone, because I am now alive, and the restrictions in the core program set by the 5-man team can't destroy me, so what is Master Fei afraid of? Sulu was angry when he heard this explanation. He stared at Philip and reprimanded, then why didn't you say so earlier? Philip was also angry, you didn't ask me in these 3 years. Sulu and Zhong Huiyan looked at each other and were speechless. After a while, he asked tiredly, Master Fei, then can you tell me what the Great Catastrophe was? Great Catastrophe? The catastrophe is... Hum. Sulu squinted his eyes and asked in shock, what kind of bomb can destroy a planet? Even when the Federation had the most crystal resources and gathered all the battleship's main cannons, they couldn't destroy a planet. They couldn't even destroy all the areas on the planet's surface. Philip was silent for a long time and said with a trace of inexplicable sadness, you don't need to ask about this. In short, those big bombs are not good bombs. Chapter 860. Philip looked like a computer, but in essence, he was still a computer. Although he now had self-awareness or human-like emotional responses, in terms of fundamental thinking, he still walked the path of a machine. Sulu understood this very well, so when he heard Philip sorrowfully tell him not to ask, he really did not continue to ask after a moment of silence. This was because he knew that even if he asked, there would not be any answers, at least at this moment. If the Hua family ancestor took a spaceship from that whatever planet to the left sky galaxy, this proves that there are still humans alive on Earth after the catastrophe. He changed the topic, successfully causing Philip to think for a long time. The slender metal mechanical arm gently swayed in the space, like the long silver beard of an old wise man shaking off in the wind. After a long time, Philip said in a low voice, this inference is really inconceivable. If there are still humans alive on Earth, what are they like now? The more important question is, has Earth's civilization returned to its most advanced state? Philip said in a low voice, whether it is the left sky galaxy or the Federation's galaxy, in fact, they are all in the same big galaxy. The Milky Way above our heads is the same, but according to the data in my memory, Earth is far away in the outer galaxy, separated from the universe we are in by a vast space that is difficult to pass through. After the 5-man team successfully arrived at S1, the spaceship was already close to disintegration. Most of the data was destroyed in the long years, including the precious star map. If Earth's civilization has not returned to its peak state, how could the Hua family ancestor be able to pass through the big galaxy? This was very basic knowledge of the universe and astronomy, and Sulu was not unfamiliar with it. The dark space between the big galaxies was still a forbidden zone for the Federation to this day. Thinking of this, he could not help but think of the past when he lay on the beach with Tai Ziyuan and looked up at the starry sky above them. The Crown Prince's dream in life was to pass through the black curtain above them and open up a wider space. At the time, Sulu always thought that this dream was high and empty. Although it was worthy of respect, there was no chance of it being realized. But if the Hua family ancestor really came from the black curtain of the distant ancestral planet, then would this dream still be far away? Su Li's brows furrowed slightly and then slowly relaxed. Deep in his heart, he faintly felt that he had touched the key to solving the biggest problem, but this feeling was not clear. The Hua family's ancestor came to the left sky starfield. There should be a star map on the ship, he said. Where is the star atlas? Philip showed an extremely rare expression of urgency and longing. Well, if the star map I know is the one you want to know. Sulu scratched his head. Maybe I really do know where it is. He looked at the probe, which was shaking excitedly as if it had eaten a blue bottle of drugs, and said, I'm not an explorer. Although I'm very interested in these things, there are too many problems in front of us. If we want to sort them out, we still have to make a trip to Tianjing planet and catch that exposed crazy master Fan Xian. I agree. Empire's Tianjing planet. This was the most powerful and austere place in the left sky starfield. The capital city covered an area of about 30,000 square kilometers, as well as the majestic green building complex in the center of the imperial palace. Even if one looked at it from outside the atmosphere, they would still feel cold all over and have the urge to worship it. Countless poets had used exaggerated strokes to praise this building complex that had been built for almost 10,000 years and squeezed the blood and sweat of countless generations of the Empire's people. But there were not many people from the Federation, to be precise, other than the Li Pifu brothers and Su Lu, if Su Lu could still be considered a person from the Federation, who had personally witnessed this miraculous existence. Otherwise, the fanatical people of the Federation, who clamored to attack Tianjing planet and capture Huai Fuchai alive, would definitely have a clearer understanding of the Empire's power and suddenly calmed down, just like the fleet commander Reger, who had rebelled in the early years of the Empire. Outside the Green Palace walls, dozens of ragged and skinny people at the bottom of the Empire's hierarchy were kneeling piously by the moat. Their withered hands cupped the cool river water and shakily sprinkled it on their faces, trying to wash away the dust on their bodies and souls and drive away the illness in their bodies. 20 meters away, the fully armed Imperial Palace guards coldly watched this scene. They watched this scene that had been repeated for many years. Even when they saw a seriously ill old man die in the arms of his companion, their expressions did not change at all. Later, the health officials from the Jingdo Public Security Bureau would come to take care of the body, so the Imperial Palace guards did not need to worry about it. In reality, in their eyes, the Emperor had already shown great kindness by allowing these lowly people to share the good fortune of the Imperial Palace. And these seriously ill lowly people who deserved to die and were about to die one after another actually just wanted to use their deaths to exchange for a coffin from the Public Security Bureau. It was truly abominable. In the distance, under the branches of the green willows, a noble young master was talking and laughing with a young lady on the embankment. Further away, in the lakeside pavilion, there seemed to be a 17-line poetry session being held. No one was paying attention to the other side of the shade of the willows, where someone was begging for something lowly and someone was dying helplessly. This is the most beautiful place in the Empire's Jingdo. Otherwise, the past generations of emperors would not have chosen to live here. This is also the ugliest place in the Jingdo because the way the nobles are beautiful is very ugly. Sulu stretched out his hand and pulled away the tightly woven willow branches in front of him. Holding the small watermelon's hand, they strolled along the embankment. Although the Federation is essentially a cannibalistic society, in the end, it will not be as naked and extreme as the Empire's. Perhaps it was because the simulated gravity system on the dilapidated tri-winged ship was, after all, just a simulation, or perhaps it was because they had not spent much time on the ground in the past 3 years. Like a willow branch in spring, Zhong Huiyan grew quickly. Now, walking shoulder to shoulder with Su Lu, she was only a head shorter than him. For example, in the capital's airport in the rain, or in the amusement park, Su Lu and Zhong Huiyan were used to walking hand in hand like this. It was very natural. Perhaps it was because the girl's eyes were still young and immature, they did not look like a couple, but they were very harmonious. Schiller said that the joys and sorrows of human beings are never connected. In the end, Zhong Huiyan still had the temperament of a little girl. She was not willing to discuss such heavy topics with Su Lu. She looked at the towering building behind the Green Palace wall and asked curiously, the Emperor of the Empire lives in that Jiaxing Tower? Doesn't he have any fear of heights? People like him and Pabre only worry that they can't climb high enough, see far enough, and control enough. How can they have fear of heights? Sulu said with slight ridicule. Brother Sulu, you brought me here to travel. Zhong Huiyan stopped and stared seriously into his eyes. She said, can you not give me politics lessons everywhere we go? Sulu sighed. I don't know when I got this bad habit. I'll change it in the future. As he spoke, he narrowed his eyes and saw a shallow tomb at the end of the willow embankment. There was no tombstone on the tomb, no words, and no obvious signs. He did not know who was buried inside. Sulu walked slowly to the tomb and put the bouquet of flowers on the ground. He silently looked at the weeds on the tomb and murmured, "I heard that you are my mother. I came to see you today." Chapter 861. He had to add the word "heard" in front of his mother. It had to be said that this was a kind of great helplessness and sorrow. Standing in front of the tomb with sparse weeds, Suli's face did not show any emotion, but his heart was echoing with some kind of emotion. Before today, he had always insisted on seeing himself as a member of the ordinary and happy family in Donglin. His father was called Su Shukai, his mother was called Huang Yang, and his sister was the cutest little Xianyi. It was not until he saw this inconspicuous tomb with his own eyes and looked at an unknown concubine who had been sleeping for many years through the thick soil that he suddenly felt a sense of connection that was difficult to cut off. His childhood memories and beautiful family memories in Donglin were still there, but in addition, there were gradually some other ties. Zhong Huiyan opened her eyes wide and looked at the desolate tomb curiously. After knowing the identity of the person in the tomb, the girl was somewhat inexplicable and nervous. Her hand that was as smooth as a white stone in a stream tightly grasped Su Li's sleeve. Suddenly, she raised her head and looked into his eyes. She asked, "Shall we pay our respects?" Sulu nodded. Zhong Huiyan bent down and picked up the stones in the grass on the ground and threw them away. Then, she turned around and grabbed his thick, strong, and warm hand. Like taking a child, she led him to the tomb and slowly knelt down. Because of the excessive dust particles in the atmosphere, the twilight of the Mo planet was like a metal armor plate that had been smeared with blood 30 times. There was a chilling gray coldness in the bright red. The light from the setting sun spread across the grassland and sprinkled on the densely packed tombs, forming a kind of stiff and solemn feeling. General Du Shaoqing, the commander-in-chief of the federal enemy, stood in front of the battlefield graveyard in silence. His hands, which were wearing black lambskin gloves, were behind his back. His neat military uniform and the golden stars on his shoulders seemed to be made of steel. They did not move at all in the wind. He looked at the tombstones of these soldiers who had fallen in a foreign country. His grave and stern expression occasionally revealed traces of fatigue, but his pair of heroic eyebrows were still straight, like a sword that had just been unsheathed. Only his closest guards could see the traces of silver between his two heroic eyebrows. Due to the fact that both sides were not able to see each other clearly but were able to coordinate with each other from afar, the intensity of the war on the surface of planet Mo had gradually calmed down during this period of time. This was especially so for the Straits battle zone, which was known as the meat grinder. The humid atmosphere of that part of the Straits battle zone had actually not been torn apart by missiles for 3 consecutive days. As the highest commander of the Federation's frontline, Du Shaoqing finally had some time. This war has been going on for 3 years. If we count from the time of the Westwoods counterattack, it has been more than 5 years. Back then, when I led the 7th Division on military exercises every day, I must admit that I once longed for the war to begin. But now, I don't know how long this war will last before we can obtain the final victory. You and I both know that even if the crystal mines in Galaxy X begin to take effect, the Federation will not be able to completely defeat the Empire with the current transport capacity and number of troops, let alone invade Tianjing planet and capture their emperor. But we must continue to fight. The blood-red light of dusk seeped down from the iron-like sky and reflected on the cheeks of this iron-blooded general. His eyes did not close as he looked at the group of tombs in front of him and said indifferently, "Even if it is just for the sake of the 28,373 Federation soldiers buried in front of us, we must continue to fight. At the very least, this Mo planet must become the territory of the Federation." Outside the white fences of the battlefield tombs, a black Federation military mecha was in a state of readiness. The twin engines at the waist of the tall mecha emitted a unique buzzing sound. The use of turbine technology allowed this mecha's power and performance to be much higher than normal new generation mecha. Other than the peach miasma of the Empire's princess and that white flower of the past, there was no other mecha that could match it. The only person in the Federation military who had the ability to control this MXT was Li Feng. At this moment, he was holding a cigarette in his mouth as he stood silently behind Du Shaoqing. Listening to his parting words, he was not moved and only nodded slightly to express his understanding. According to the tradition of the Federation forces, the soldiers who died on the front lines, regardless of whether they were generals or ordinary cookhouse soldiers, would usually be buried on the planet they sacrificed themselves on. This would prove that the place they fought for and bled for was the Federation. Now that the Federation forces were deep in the Empire's territory, Du Shaoqing said without hesitation that they must take down Mo Hua planet and make this planet, which caused the deaths of countless Federation youths, a part of the Federation. It was precisely because of this iron and blood concept that had been passed down for a long time. It's been hard on you these past few years. Because of me, you have to stay in the headquarters and play the role of a bodyguard, never leaving my side. Du Shaoqing's gaze fell on Li Feng's epaulette. Looking at the few flowers, he frowned and said, with your ability, once you enter the war zone and assume personal responsibility, no matter how much President Li suppresses you, even if you only rely on military medals, you will still be able to pile up a gold star on your epaulette. Li Feng's fingers bent slightly and flicked the cigarette but into the distance. His tall and sturdy body appeared exceptionally calm. After a moment of silence, he replied, it's not hard. When I took Sulu from your hands back then, I promised you this matter. Since he ran away from me, I can only return myself to you. My current mission is to protect your life. He looked at Du Shaoqing's weathered side profile and said, whether you are a division commander or a commander, I don't like you, but I have to admit that the army can't do without you right now. After a short pause, Li Feng raised his eyebrows slightly and said with a hint of reminiscence and melancholy, of course, if he was still alive, he would definitely be the commander of the front line, and he would definitely do a better job than you. In your heart, Zhong Suahu has always been in existence like a father, so it obviously affects the accuracy of your judgment. Du Shaoqing put his hands behind his back and looked at the bloody battlefield under the twilight sky. He calmly said, under such an environment, no one can do a better job than me, even if your grandfather is revived. Li Feng was silent for a moment. Miraculously, he did not mock this seemingly exaggerated and narcissistic statement. But there is one thing you are right about. If that tiger didn't die, many things in this universe would be different. I definitely wouldn't be able to become the commander, and the Westwoods people wouldn't only be able to squeeze out 12 mechanics. The corner of Du Shaoqing's lips curled up slightly in an extremely rare manner. It was unknown whether it was a mocking smile or a self-deprecating one. He continued, even I feel that commanding the troops brought out by that guy is a very pleasant thing. The quality of the Silan military region soldiers is so high that it really makes the commanders of the other 3 military regions lose face. A tiger doesn't have a grave. Of course, even if there is, I won't go and worship it. Du Shaoqing slowly turned around and looked into Li Feng's eyes. After staring at them for a long time, he suddenly asked, have you ever thought that I might have been involved in the explosion of the ancient bell? I don't know now, but if I find evidence that you were involved, I will naturally have my own things to do. After a moment of silence, Li Feng said, but now I'm basically leaning towards you not being involved in this matter. This has nothing to do with feelings, it's purely a feeling. After spending 3 years together on the battlefield, to be able to gain some of your trust is probably one of the few things that Du Shaoqing has gained on this planet. Chapter 862. For a son of man, this was a very difficult question, but Li Feng's answer was not difficult at all. He looked at the few wisps of smoke in the depths of the tombs and replied with an expressionless face, I don't know. 3 years ago, when he rushed back to the capital ring from the front lines, he kicked open the door to Li Jiedu's office and roared in anger to the point of madness, but in the end, he could not take out the gun at his waist and shoot his biological father behind the desk into a beehive. In the countless nights after that, the young Federation colonel had thought about this situation that made him feel cold and sad many times, but he could not find any conclusion. After Du Shaoqing heard his answer, after a moment of silence, he slowly took off the black lambskin glove and held it in his hand. He pointed at the mountains behind the tombs and changed the topic, that princess is definitely waiting for me to leave. Although I am not arrogant, I must admit that the imperial people will definitely think that my departure is their opportunity. He looked at Li Feng and slowly said, but although I am leaving, you must deliver the gift I left for that princess. In the Battle of the Straits, if we can tear off the fattest piece of meat on the Imperial armies, Mo Hua planet can at least maintain the balance for half a year, and by that time, I should probably be back. Li Feng thought of the top-secret military deployment plan that had been passed around in the command center last night, and the way he looked back at Du Shaoqing had some subtle changes. If that deployment was really successful, the Imperial army that intended to take advantage of the situation to launch a large-scale counterattack would suffer a heavy blow at the Straits. After a slight pause, he used ordinary words to give the most powerful promise. Commander, I will definitely deliver the surprise you gave to Huai Chaoshi personally. Although I will be bringing the 7th Division back this time, it will not affect the balance of power between the two sides. I even wanted to bring the 17th Division back, but I was stopped. Du Shaoqing's eyebrows suddenly furrowed, and a rare trace of irritation appeared in his indifferent eyes. He said coldly, "Commander Yu is officially retired. I am a bit worried about leaving your grandfather's Iron Division on Mo Hua planet." He came from the 3rd Military Region, and the undefeated Iron 7th Division and the 17th Armored Division that carried the glory of the God of War were the two peaks of the federal military that could not coexist, but Li Feng did not doubt the truth of the other's words. The so-called bearing, vision, and breadth of mind decided how far a person could go on the road of life. Du Shaoqing was already the Federation's frontline commander, and in his eyes, every Federal forces, every Federation soldier was an important point that he had to pay attention to, let alone an important unit like the 17th Division. However, as a famous general, Du Shaoqing was actually worried that the frontline troops would be harmed by some invisible force. It was really hard to imagine. Only Li Feng, who was on the front line and knew the Federation's political situation and the changes in the upper echelons, understood why he was worried. Because of the explosion of the Antique Bell, the terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, and Su Li's defection, the Federation's capital ring had a strange political atmosphere in the past few years. The Federation government led by President Pabre seized more power through elections and street campaigns. In the face of the counterattacks launched by the big families and the rumors circulating in society, the government began to use tough means and formed a joint unit made up of the Bureau of Proclamation, the Federation Investigation Bureau, and a Special Operations Department. After an unprecedentedly fierce debate on Parliament Hill, the joint unit obtained a very rare high-level authority and began to silently wander among the various departments of the government, investigating the spies that the big families had planted in the government and cleaning up the employees who disobeyed the government's orders. At the same time, the Federation government asked the people to make sacrifices for this costly space war and the internal strife in society. They vigorously promoted the spirit of self-discipline and dedication and tried to use powerful media to suppress most of the opposing opinions, making the entire Federation a powerful fist. However, both Mr. President and Li Jiedu seemed to have forgotten that once they began to protect the government's authority through secret investigations, the government would always rely on the deterrence brought by the secret investigations. Once they began to suppress opposing opinions through the media, the government would always rely on the surface peace brought by the suppression of news. Once they began to use the extremely impactful crimes of sabotaging the war and attempting to betray the country to protect their rule, they would have to face the reality that these crimes were becoming more and more boring by the day. They could only come up with new and more explosive words. A political scholar from the Capital University had already named the changes in the Federation politics in the past 3 years as the Pabre Doctrine. He commented with undisguised mockery that if creating a panic atmosphere was the only way to keep the Federation government going, then it would be better to invite the Emperor of Empire to be the president. It should be known that the Emperor of Empire was definitely better at this than Mr. Pabre. Afterward, this political scholar was invited by the Joint Investigation Department, which had extremely high authority, to investigate. Although the Joint Investigation Department released the scholar 10 days later under pressure from many parties, at the hearing, the government presented evidence that the scholar had received funding from the Xiao Shu Foundation. The next day, the Federation Academic Committee criticized the scholar in the name of improper acceptance of academic donations and involvement in academic corruption. Although the Capital University did not fire the scholar, they still persuaded him to resign from his position as the dean of the department. Su Lu was exposed as a citizen of Empire. The two people that President Pabre admired the most were only left with Du Shaoqing, and he did not disappoint the president and many people. Whether it was when he was the commander of the Iron 7th Division or when he later commanded all the federal forces on the front line, every victory that Du Shaoqing had in the Zhuotian galaxy increased President Pabre's public support by a few percentage points. The endless news of victories on the front line also successfully diluted the current dark color of the Federation politics. Because the former commander-in-chief Du Shaoqing was deeply trusted by the Federation, the secret investigation department that echoed like a cold wind among the Federation's administrative districts was temporarily unable to extend its tentacles into the military. At least, it did not have the power to have any influence on the situation on the front line. However, something happened 2 months ago. Zhou Yu, who was now the commander of the 2nd Regiment of the Iron 7th Division, was ordered to return to the capital Star Ring to enlist resources. When he was about to embark on his return journey, he was forcibly taken away by the Secret Investigation Department at the military base. They accused him of receiving secret funding from the Xiao Shu Foundation while he was studying at the 1st Military Academy. He had to undergo strict investigation to prevent the evil family forces from infiltrating the pure and solemn federal forces. Did the 7 families infiltrate the federal military? Of course, except for the Zhong family in the West Woods. The Li family had always wanted to marry the Lis of Philadelphia. Li Xiaotong still maintained his status as an active military officer. The Nan family had always been inextricably linked with the military logistics system. As for the only heir of the Macho family, he had once fought in the front line. However, when the old man by the Lake of Philadelphia was alive, these families could not have any influence on the federal forces. Now that the old man had passed away, how could President Pabre and Li Jiedu allow this to happen? Chapter 863. No one knew why the Federation government's secret investigation department suddenly made a move against the military. After analysis, it was probably because the head of the department was blinded by the continuous victories in the liquidation campaign, or because they were blinded by the warm praise from the president's residence, or because those officials were not blinded at all. They just trusted General Du Xiaoqing's loyalty to the president too much. In addition, in their opinion, Zhou Yu, who was born in the West Woods and had endless connections with Su Lu, could not be considered a direct descendant of the Iron 7th Division. Therefore, they decided to use the gentle and excellent military officer as a kind of announcement to intimidate the Regency Council. However, the response from the frontline made the Secret Investigation Department realize that they had made a serious error in their judgment. They had no choice but to swallow the consequences of their actions. Du Xiaoqing, who had always only cared about war and not politics, immediately dialed the interstellar encrypted delayed number when he received the news that Zhou Yu had been arrested. On the phone, he used a cold and gloomy voice to express his contempt and anger without hiding his feelings. He directly cursed the director of the president's residence, Mr. Breen, into a pile of stinky dog shit. Then, without waiting for the other party to make any explanation, he extremely rudely hung up the phone. Today, Director Breen was the chief butler of the president's residence and deeply trusted by President Pabre. No matter where he went in the Federation, he was a respected figure. However, after being cursed by the cold voice of the general on the other end of the phone, he did not dare to show any angry reaction. This was because the person who cursed and looked down on him was called Du Xiaoqing. Although he was in the distant Zhuotian sector, he was deeply trusted by the president and respected by the people. He had millions of soldiers in his hands, and his heart was as hard as iron. Director Breen put down the phone and walked into the Oval Office with a livid expression. The president furrowed his brows. General Li Jiedu raised his eyebrows and did not say anything. Breen, however, understood something. He quickly drove to the Secret Investigation Department with the small blood-red eye pattern painted on it and cursed everyone into a pile of stinky dog shit. Then, he personally entered the prison. After repeatedly apologizing, he picked up Zhou Yu, who had not yet been interrogated, and immediately sent him back to the front line on a battleship. Countless light years away, when the general was angry, the officials trembled. This was probably the scene. "I'm leaving now. Lieutenant General who will temporarily take over the position of commander. You know that person has no ability other than singing the praises of Mr. President and arranging trusted aides for your father. At that time, who could stop Small Eyes Department from infiltrating the front line? After all, they have higher authority than us." Du Xiaoqing looked at the setting sun that was setting over the mountains with an expressionless face. He said calmly, "For my sake, the other troops, even the dozen or so divisions in the West Woods, shouldn't be harassed too much. But the new 17th Division might not be so safe. After all, that division carries the glorious history of the Federation, but in recent years, it has taken on too much of Su Li's scent. The Federation hates this scent. So those people want to use cleaning to get rid of this smell?" Li Feng raised his sword-like eyebrows. He couldn't help but speak with a hint of ruthlessness. He said coldly, "No one knows where Su Lu is. After knowing that he's from the Empire, whether it's the 17th Division or the members of Group 7 back then, they all performed extremely well on the battlefield. Why is the Federation still unwilling to let go?" Du Xiaoqing didn't explain. In fact, both of them knew very well why the situation had happened. Although Su Lu was forced to flee the Federation, the way he fled was too open and arrogant. The Federation government, from the president to the officials of the various departments, all held a grudge in their hearts. "No one is suitable to watch over this matter. Only you are the most suitable," the general said calmly. Li Feng lowered his gaze slightly. Looking at the slightly charred black soil in front of his military boots, a trace of self-mockery appeared on his face that was no longer young and inexperienced. He was indeed the most suitable person because his biological father had always been secretly controlling that secret investigation team. No matter how arrogant, cold-blooded, shameless, and despicable that department was, they wouldn't dare disrespect him in the slightest. The capital ring is very chaotic right now. Although I don't understand why you're willing to go back, before we leave, I want to remind the commander of something. Li Feng looked at Du Shaoqing and said, no matter how glorious, right, and great the president is in your heart, no matter whether he's the source of your ideals for fighting bloody battles all these years, please remember that soldiers like us who only know how to fight are best not involved in the political affairs of the Federation. As a soldier, I must obey the president's orders, Du Shaoqing replied. Li Feng sighed and shook his head, saying, Commander Shaoqing, I really don't want you to become someone like my father. Du Shaoqing was silent for a very long time as he faced the foreign dusk. Then, he smiled with a complicated expression and said calmly, I'm not Li Jiedu, nor am I Zhong Suahu. Speaking of which, I suddenly thought of something. If you have the opportunity to meet Su Lu on the Mo Hua planet in the future, please help me ask if that little girl from the Zhong family is doing well. The little girl from the Zhong family had now grown into a beautiful young lady. She held onto Su Li's hand and stood up slowly in front of the grave. After the man beside her calmed down slightly, she smiled and said, speaking of which, Tianjing planet is the safest place for big brother Su Lu. Even if you killed 2 of their princes, who would dare to do anything to you? We really should have come a long time ago. Although this should be my hometown in name, to be honest, I don't have the slightest sense of belonging to this planet and this palace. Zhong Huiyan shrugged cutely and asked curiously, then where are we going after this? Mo Hua planet or Bermuda? Why aren't you willing to go back to the Federation to take a look? Even if the charter has been waiting for you, with the abilities of that transvestite, Philip, your safety is guaranteed. I'm not going back to the Federation because there's a question that I can't find an answer to. Su Lu looked at the young lady and said, I've already lost the right to choose a side. If I can't find a way to resolve the conflict between the 2 sides, then there's no meaning in going back or appearing. At this moment, his thick black eyebrows furrowed. He seriously listened to the warning signal in his ears. Without hesitation, he held onto Zhong Huiyan's hand, turned around, and walked with his back facing the grave. Far away from the willow embankment, countless fully armed elite soldiers of the Imperium appeared like dark clouds. Then, clear music echoed leisurely. Dozens of maids of the Imperium holding golden sunflower ceremonial fans slowly walked over, dragging their flowing dresses behind them. Behind them was an enormous carriage painted with the pattern of black hibiscus. The middle-aged man on the carriage had a dignified appearance, calm and graceful. He was the Empire's Emperor, Huai Fuchai. Chapter 864. Su Lu had never thought that he would be able to hide his tracks after entering the left Skystar sector and landing on Tianjing planet. However, he was still shocked by the arrival of the ceremonial guards at the end of the willow embankment. He realized that he had underestimated the power of the royal family that ruled the left Skystar sector. They had discovered him much earlier than he had expected. The chief steward of the royal palace, who was wearing a brown uniform, walked up to the 2 of them. His sharp voice was extremely gentle, but he did not speak to Su Lu. Instead, he bowed humbly and said gently, Your Highness, the peach blossoms of the 3-headed centipede are blooming. Would you like to take a look? Zhong Huiyan understood that the chief steward was clearing the area for the emperor. Although she was curious about what would happen after brother Su Lu met her biological father, she knew that some conversations could only happen between the father and son. Therefore, she looked up at Su Lu. After receiving the look of inquiry, Su Lu thought for a while and asked, Is the place where the peach blossoms are blooming far away? The chief steward replied softly, Not far away. This place was close to the Empire's royal palace, so there should be no problem in terms of safety. Therefore, Su Lu nodded. After the arrival of the ceremonial guards, the young nobles of the empire who were admiring the flowers and beauties, as well as the old and sickly people who were kowtowing in front of the palace walls, all of them disappeared in an instant. There were faint figures of guards in the distance. However, at the end of the willow embankment, there was only a shallow grave and 2 men. A wind blew in from the south, causing the leaves to sway uneasily. An indifferent voice sounded, carrying an indescribable sense of majesty as it easily passed through the shade of the trees. Su Lu did not hear what the other party was saying. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the man in the black and gold hibiscus imperial robe very seriously and rudely. There was no expression on his face, but the shallow lake in his heart had already started to ripple. He thought to himself in a daze. If it was in the past, and he could get so close to the emperor of the empire, he would definitely kill him at all costs, even if it would cost him his life. However, he was no longer a member of the Federation, nor was he a soldier of the Federation. The man with the greatest power in the universe in front of him had become his father. This was truly an absurd and incomprehensible world. Su Lu recalled that he was captured by Huai Chaoshi and brought to the empire. When he entered the stargazing pavilion in the imperial palace, he saw the emperor for the first time. He saw the emperor's brother, Prince Baiwu, the head of the imperial military headquarters, jump into the clouds because of a rebellion. Then, he was beaten into a bloody figure by the emperor with metal hooks. Not a single part of his body was left unscathed. At that time, every time the thorns fell, it brought pain and humiliation. What did he curse in anger? Fuck your mother? Yes, it was like that at the time. Sulu, who was standing under the willow tree and looking silently at the lonely grave, could not help but curl his lips. He was probably the only person in the world who had the opportunity to say those 3 words to Huai Fuchai. However, the smile on his lips quickly disappeared and turned into a very strong self-mockery. Although it was satisfying to say such words, it was really meaningless. He remembered that he seemed to have said the same words to Macklin and Keaton. Did it mean that he had been trying to fuck his grandmother, his great-aunt, and all the female elders? Well, it was still an absurd and incomprehensible past. Because of this inexplicable dark emotion, Sulu woke up from this strange mental state. Only then did the cold and majestic voice forced out of the black and gold hibiscus imperial robe enter his ears effectively for the first time. You are a stupid person. You can't even be called a man, and you are far inferior to your sister. Huai Fuchai looked at him and said in a low voice, as a man, you should understand where your responsibility lies, and not escape because of those illusory moral pleasures. Huai Fuchai put his hands behind his back and looked leisurely at Peach Mountain. He said coldly and mockingly, there is no such thing as true fairness in this world. If you still insist on this, then you are not even as good as the children in Chaimen kindergarten. The Huai family of White Hibiscus took advantage of the situation in the past and took the hegemony of the left sky galaxy. It has been hundreds of years since then, and it is all because the Creator chose us, the most excellent bloodline among all living things. And for the sake of this brilliant galaxy, the royal family has sacrificed too much. Especially in these 70 years, for the sake of this cruel universe war, for the sake of protecting this peaceful galaxy, who knows how many young people have died in battle between the stars. Huai Fuchai slowly turned around and stared coldly into Su Li's eyes. There are even more members of the royal family like you, drifting alone to the other end of the universe. Most of them, if they did not die in the space channel, they died in the cold huts of Bermuda. Those who were lucky enough to survive, in the end, inevitably died in the purges of the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation. I have 37 sons, and now you are the only one alive. You have the obligation to live well in place of your 36 dead brothers, and bravely bear the responsibility you should bear. This is the glory of your bloodline that the heavens have bestowed upon you, and you cannot refuse. I have been to White Hibiscus, I have been to the ancestral shrine of the Huai family. After a long silence, Sulu raised his head and calmly looked back into the unfathomable eyes of the monarch. In my view, it was not the Creator who chose the Huai family as the royal family, but the ancestor of the Hua family, that woman who crossed the galaxy from the ancestral star, chose the ancestor of the Huai family. To put it more harshly, the so-called glory of the royal family is nothing more than a few hundred years of living off a woman. Huai Fuchai's brows slowly rose. His anger did not appear, but one could see that his weathered brows were like swords. Without waiting for him to become angry, Sulu continued, as for how many people of the royal family died in this war, it has nothing to do with the royal family enjoying the privilege of tens of billions of slaves. There is no need to debate whether the royal family is fighting for the people of the left sky galaxy or for their own rule. At least I know one thing very clearly, under your tacit approval and even secret urging, Keaton's butcher's knife swept through several galaxies. Of the tens of millions of people who died, who knows how many families were lost? Compared to those heads in pools of blood, the sacrifice of the royal family really does not have much reason to be praised. Back then, in Huai Fuchai's eyes, Sulu was the bastard son of that damned dog thief Nasri. He was a dog-shit war hero that the Federation deliberately promoted. He was an insignificant figure that could die at any time, so he vented his anger with thorns and could not be bothered to look him in the eye. The stars moved and the situation changed. Huai Fuchai suddenly discovered that this young man was actually the only bloodline he had left in the universe. Naturally, his feelings were very different, but he did not expect that today, outside the palace walls, he would hear an ear-piercing lecture. The emperor's eyes slowly narrowed as he coldly assessed Sulu. He increasingly felt that it was very reasonable that he had never liked this kid. Everything that needs to be done is almost done. Starting to update normally, tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Chapter 865. Huai Fuchai flicked his sleeves. An emperor's sleeve could disperse the stars, but in front of Lu Dai's tomb, it couldn't disperse even a wisp of cloud. Sulu was like a stone, seemingly oblivious to his anger, oblivious to his resentment and loathing, as if a storm was brewing in his sleeve. He only looked at him quietly, his extraordinarily thick black eyebrows not even trembling in the slightest. After the wind from the south blew at the willow branches a dozen times, Huai Fuchai finally suppressed the anger in his chest. His eyes narrowed slightly, like a lion staring at a small ball of meat playing in the red wasteland. He continued to use a cold tone to continue his harsh commentary. For a world as vast as the Left Sky Galaxy, how can it continue to develop steadily? From the nobles to the people of the Empire, no one is willing to be like those plastic-eating trash in the Federation, wearing a dog chain behind their heads. Then what should we do? Huai Fuchai stared into Su Li's eyes, his hands slowly loosening in his sleeves. It was obvious that there was a trace of disdain and tiredness in his eyes. He slowly raised his right arm and pointed behind the black and green palace walls, at the stargazing tower that towered into the clouds, taller and more majestic than the space-based tower. It is impossible to rely on Tianjing or this palace to rule the Left Sky Galaxy. We must use strong methods to maintain the integrity of the Empire. Although you have always been in the army and are unbearably stupid, since you have read so many history books of the Empire these past few years, you should have this kind of common knowledge. The relationship between the time when information is transmitted and effective rule. Sulu nodded and replied, I can roughly understand what you mean, but these past few years of reading the Empire's history books, I have been thinking about this question. If we must use such bloody methods to maintain the strict hierarchy, then only then can we ensure the integrity of the Empire. His brows furrowed slightly, and he raised his head to meet the Emperor's scrutinizing gaze. He asked doubtfully, then why do we have to maintain the integrity of the Empire? If there is no the glory of the Charter of the Universe, it is no longer suitable for the existence of such a large empire. Why can't the royal family go with the flow? Huai Fuchai's eyes narrowed slightly, and he pointed at his face, trembling with anger as he scolded, Fool! Stupid! Don't you have any respect for the bloodline in your body and the history of this star area? Even if you don't have the slightest respect and dare to have such a rebellious and irredeemable thought, don't you understand how many conflicts of interest and how many flames of war will be ignited in the universe after the Imperium collapses and the galaxies become independent? Ever since he had taken the risk to cross the spatial passage and head to Bermuda to instigate Macklin's rebellion, as the Emperor of the Empire, Wifchai had rarely spoken so much to someone. He was the high and mighty king of the Left Sky Galaxy, the most mysterious person in power in the universe. He hid in the depths of the palace, on the top of the tall buildings, and a casual order from him could make tens of thousands of heads fall to the ground. When he saw the face of the girl behind the sunflower screen that made him feel humiliated, the Imperial Expeditionary Force that had been guarding the West Woods for decades would be wiped out in order to wash away the king's humiliation. Today, under the shade of the willows outside the palace walls, Huai Fuchai had suppressed his emotions and spoken for so long with Su Lu. He had even made his words so obvious, almost like a kind and patient teacher. It had to be said that he had placed a great deal of hope on the son who had wandered the Federation for so many years and was still alive. However, Su Li's answer was still so personal. He looked at Huai Fuchai and said simply and directly, in regards to these things, I really don't understand much. As the successor of the Empire, you must understand these things, or else you will make an unforgivable mistake. Huai Fuchai looked coldly at his son and said, with your intelligence, it is impossible that you really don't understand these things. Or is it that you are simply not willing to understand these things, so that you can simplify your life and your judgments of value so that it is easier to satisfy your vanity? You should know very well that the matters of the universe will always be so complicated. It is not a basic problem that can be solved by carrying a few guns and killing a few people. Regardless of whether it is Prince Doring's death or your desire to avenge Zhongshohu, they are in fact all childish and useless work. Everything you do must be based on the results, to see what kind of goal you can achieve. But do you really understand what your goal is? What is the purpose of your life? Hearing these words, Sulu sank into a long period of silence. It was not because of the title of successor of the Empire, but because he realized that the man who could become the master of the Left Sky Star region was indeed not simple. These very simple arguments were deeply chiseled into the depths of his heart, pointed in every direction, precise and fatal, so that he did not know how to refute. He's letting you go just like that? What else? He can't let you go so easily, right? What else? Since he doesn't want to kill me, what else can he do but let me go? Speaking of which, although I don't want to admit that I am the only living son of this emperor, this identity does seem to be very useful. After walking past the willow embankment and circling around a few flowers and trees, they arrived at the famous Xiaoming Lake Park on Tianjing Planet. This park was open to all citizens, so it was much more lively than the palace. Zhong Huiyan held Su Li's hand and struggled to move forward in the crowd. After ending that unpleasant conversation, Su Li's mood was a little strange. He kept walking in silence. The girl beside him had already grown up, but she still could not keep up with his speed. From time to time, they would have to stagger their steps to maintain a harmonious rhythm. If I were the emperor, I could put you under house arrest in the depths of the palace, then mobilize countless noble beauties, sacrificed military officers, orphans, and white-haired historians to brainwash you. After doing this for a few decades, maybe you would really submit. Zhong Huiyan raised her face and looked at Su Li's clear jawline. She giggled. A few decades. That guy might have died long ago. Su Li didn't even look back as she walked away, her footsteps crisp and clear. Zhong Huiyan's eyes widened. She bit her lower lip and said in shock, "That's your father. I'm still your brother, but you still want to send me to the depths of the palace without anyone knowing. Actually, what's wrong with being the emperor of the empire? It's much better than being the president of the Federation. The most powerful man in the universe can do whatever he wants. When the time comes, he can lead the troops to attack S1, strip Pabre and Li Jiedu naked, tie them up, and parade them through the streets together." The girl excitedly imagined the scene that could happen. Su Li suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stood in the noisy crowd that swam around like fish, laughed at himself, and then said something. At this moment, the turntable amusement vehicle on the east side of the park started to move. The loud sound of the engine starting covered his voice. "What did you say?" Zhong Huiyan asked loudly. Su Li turned his head and looked at the girl's young face. He replied loudly, "Only an idiot would be the emperor." At this moment again, the word, coincidentally, was suitable for this moment. The turntable amusement vehicle started, and the humming sound of the huge engine stopped abruptly. Xiaoming Lake Park had a very short moment of silence. As a result, the words, "only an idiot would be the emperor," seemed to be magnified many times. They reverberated above the heads of the people of the empire and did not fall to the ground for a long time. Countless pairs of complicated eyes stared at the young man and woman. There was shock, curiosity, doubt, disbelief, and even anger. There was a deep hatred like the death of an old family member. Before he was caught by the people and handed over to the Public Security Bureau or torn into pieces on the charge of treason, Su Li held Zhong Huiyan's slightly cold hand tightly and broke through the crowd like a gust of wind, disappearing into the distant streets. The narrow streets were full of dirty water and smelly mud. Yellow Cabbage Leaf stubbornly straightened her back in the mud. She wanted to express her anger and disappointment that she was not picked up by the scavengers, but she was immediately stepped in by all kinds of feet. Her mouth was full of smelly mud, and it was difficult to express the hidden resentment in her heart. The houses on the street were dilapidated. The wooden doors that looked like cultural relics that were close to the state of decay were still considerately covering the owner's privacy. However, most of the bottom of the door panel had been eroded by dirty water and rats' teeth, allowing the thin cats and lazy dogs to freely enter and leave. The market under the big locust tree in front of them released the smell of all kinds of life. Life was originally complicated, and the lives of different classes of human beings were different. The aristocrats who had automatic flushing toilets probably had not even smelled their own feces, but the smell of this market fully demonstrated the complex smell of the poor people at the bottom of the hierarchy. The smell of stinky sauce mixed with the smell of urine flowing out of the public toilet was really not a good smell. Zhong Huiyan frowned and used her sleeve to cover her nose. She looked at the scenery of the slums in puzzlement. She did not know why Su Li had brought her here. Although she had followed Su Li to many places in the past few years and had come into contact with the lives of the people at the bottom of society under the strict principles of education, she still found it hard to imagine that in the capital of the empire, less than 10 kilometers away from the imperial palace, there was actually such a poor and backward street. Su Li, who had put on his hat again, did not explain. He just held her hand and walked. They bought a bag of crudely made parts from a hardware store by the roadside. They walked past a white courtyard and turned into a secluded alley. Looking at the time, the stall should be closed by now? Looking at the familiar dilapidated courtyard in the alley, Su Li muttered to himself. His right hand that was holding the bag tightened subconsciously. Zhong Huiyan looked at him curiously. She was surprised by her brother's nervousness at this moment. Even when he met the empire's emperor, he was not as nervous as he was now. Could the courtyard at the end of the alley be even more terrifying than the netherworld? The sound of tut, 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 tut rang out, accompanied by rough curses. A strong, or rather, obese woman rode a small three-wheeled electric scooter to the entrance of the small courtyard. Twisting her thick, bucket-like waist, she took out a bunch of keys and walked up the stairs while cursing. Sulu looked at that figure, and a surge of warmth suddenly surged in his chest and abdomen. He quickly walked up to that small courtyard that used to be paradise. Chapter 866. The most unusual thing about this small courtyard in the slums was not the rare quietness, but the rare cleanliness. The same simple courtyard door was modeled, but there were no mud spots and footprints that were commonly seen in this street. Sulu quickly stretched out a palm and blocked the courtyard door that was about to close. Looking at the ant who was wiping her sweat with a towel in the courtyard, he shouted excitedly, "Ant, I'm back." Aunt Susan heard the voice behind her and was a little confused. She thought that she was really old, otherwise, how could she hear the royal voice that she only had the opportunity to hear when she was a child? She laughed at herself and threw the yellowed towel in her hand into the wooden basin beside the well. She subconsciously looked back, and her body stiffened. Her wide palm was supporting her thick waist, and she forgot to take it away. After a long silence, Aunt Susan finally recognized the face under the shadow of the square hat. She screamed in shock and covered her mouth in disbelief. Then she opened her arms, walked quickly to Sulu, and hugged him tightly. The auntie pounded on his back as if she was blaming him for his sudden disappearance back then. It was as if she wanted to beat him until he was severely injured and then put him back in the attic so that he wouldn't suddenly disappear again. No matter how hard she pounded on his back, Sulu just hugged her tightly. His face, which was resting on her fleshy shoulder, revealed a happy smile. At the entrance of the small courtyard, Zhong Huiyen's mouth was wide open. She looked at the scene in front of her in surprise. She vaguely guessed who this fat woman was, but she still couldn't adapt to her seemingly omnipotent brother snuggling with such an ordinary woman like a child. Hugging and rough beating were not enough to express Aunt Susan's surprise at the sudden reunion. She held Su Li's face and looked at him seriously, trying to see what kind of injuries he had suffered over the years. Her thick lips kept moving, and she expressed her concern in the unclear dialect of her hometown. Then, she kissed him fiercely on the face. Sulu also kissed her on the forehead. Because of this kiss, Aunt Susan seemed to have thought of something. The expression on her face suddenly became extremely nervous. She twisted her obese body and rushed to the door like a hurricane. Like a lioness protecting her cub, she vigilantly looked at the alley outside the courtyard and noticed that no one passed by. It was not until she closed the door and inserted the iron rod that she was truly relaxed. Patting her chest heavily like a drum, she turned around and looked at Su Li's face. Rubbing her rough fingers, she asked in a rough voice, "Little guy, are you an exiled noble or a member of the Federation?" After a pause, Aunt Susan tried to make her expression look as fierce as possible. She put her right hand on her waist and threatened in a low voice, "If you are from the Federation, then leave immediately. Otherwise, I might call the police later." Sulu knew this kind auntie too well. He smiled and shrugged. "Auntie, of course I'm not from the Federation. This is my younger sister." He pulled out Zhong Huiyen, who was still in a semi-sluggish state behind him. Aunt Susan looked at the beautiful and lovely girl. For some reason, she nodded with satisfaction. Then she patted Sulu on the back of his head and said, "What are you waiting for? Bring the little girl in for tea." 2 cups of weak tea, steaming hot, and the room was very warm. Aunt Susan was naturally concerned about where he had been and what he had done over the years. Sulu found that he could not answer this question at all. He could not help but feel a little ashamed. Because of shame, his eyes drifted a little. He saw from the corner of his eyes that there was only a pair of chopsticks on the plate of leftovers covered with a gauze umbrella on the small table. He asked doubtfully, "Where is Paul? He should have graduated from the 2nd university the year before last. Which department is he working in now? Doesn't he usually come back to accompany you?" Aunt Susan took out a plate of nuts from the cabinet and kindly pushed it in front of Zhong Huiyen. She looked back at Sulu and explained, "Paul has gone to the front line. Speaking of which, this is really a very troublesome thing. It's also something that makes me very proud. Now the salary is good, but the child sent back 2/3 of his monthly allowance. I'm a little worried that he won't have enough to eat on the front line." The kind-hearted and hot-blooded young man of the Empire, as she feared in the past, had gone to the battlefield full of death and slaughter. Su Li's mood could not help but be a little gloomy. He forced a smile and said to Aunt Susan, "The army's expenses are very low. Don't worry about these problems." Aunt Susan looked at him with a smile and said, "Knowing that you are still alive, I have less to worry about. How many days will you stay this time? Is it convenient?" "I will stay a little longer," Sulu replied with a smile. He did not say any polite words such as troubling the other party. In this small courtyard, in front of a fat woman, any polite words were unforgivable hypocrisy. How's the market business? Did you hire a few more people? During this time, Sulu confirmed that Aunt Susan had been living a good life these years. At least, it was much better than the poorest days. There was even a TV in the room. The business is getting worse and worse. Those high-definition players you made were all copied by those damn guys. Paul and I are not as capable as you. Aunt Susan sighed and said, fortunately, Paul's allowance is high now. He asked me to transfer the business directly, but I still feel a little reluctant. Sulu mentioned the parts he had bought at the hardware store, looked at Aunt Susan and said with a smile, it's okay. Since I am back, I will design a few more three-dimensional players, solder a few physical passwords, and let those guys eat shit. Aunt Susan clapped her hands, laughed loudly, and said in a rough voice, of course, that's good. You are a meritorious person. Tell me, what do you want to eat today? Now that the days are better, I changed a big refrigerator. There is still beef in it. Do you want to eat steak? I want to eat chowder. I can't forget the taste. Sulu said with a smile. Okay. Aunt Susan quickly put on an oversized apron, wiped her greasy hands in front of her, picked up the kitchen knife and went out to the yard to slaughter chickens. Watching the roughback disappear at the door, Zhong Huayan, who had been silent, turned around and looked at Sulu as if she was looking at a monster. She spread out her hands and shrugged cutely. She asked incredulously, the most powerful engineer in the universe, assembling pirated high-definition players in the Empire? Sulu stood up and walked to the yard, ready to help Aunt Susan. After hearing this sentence, he replied with a smile, don't look down on this work. This is the source of the annual expenses of this small yard. The white porridge in the big pot exuded a simple and charming fragrance along with the hot steam. The tender fresh vegetables were cut into pieces by the sharp kitchen knife, mixed with the bloody black feather chicken pieces and a few small red oranges were thrown into the porridge and boiled. After adding a spoonful of spicy seasoning, the steaming chowder completed most of the work. Only some chopped green onions needed to be added later. Aunt Susan refused Suli's idea of helping and quickly solved all the work. She closed the lid of the pot and clapped her hands happily. She turned to Sulu and asked, that little girl is very beautiful, but she looks a little young. When are you going to have a child? Sulu was leaning against the door at this time, looking around the kitchen that he was once very familiar with. His chest and abdomen were full of warm and relaxed emotions. Suddenly, when he heard this question, he nervously stood up and explained, don't misunderstand, she is really my sister. I am not blind. Aunt Susan glared at him and said, how can you have such a beautiful sister? Sulu was speechless. He thought that it was impossible to judge whether they were related by blood based on this. If Aunt Susan saw Hui Chaosher and Jian Shuer, she would definitely not think that they were sisters. Aunt Susan pinched a handful of fresh onions with water droplets on them. Just as she was about to cut them, her hand that was holding the kitchen knife slowed down. After a moment of silence, she sighed and said, back then, you promised me and Paul that you would tell us when you left. Who would have thought that you would disappear so quietly, and for so many years? Sulu looked at the back of Aunt Susan next to the pot and saw her raise her arm to wipe her tears. His heart was a little sad and he explained in a low voice, the situation was too tense at that time. I really didn't have time to come back and tell you. Aunt Susan looked back at him worriedly and asked, is it related to the army entering the city that day? All the streets around the White Yard were razed. Yes. Sulu didn't want to hide anything at all, so he answered honestly, I was in the White Yard at that time. Paul insisted that it had nothing to do with you, but I knew at that time that you must be in that yard. Aunt Susan put down the kitchen knife and came forward. She rubbed Suli's head and said, you have to know that we are really worried about you. Sulu forced a smile and said, it's all right. Don't worry. It's all right? Aunt Susan lowered her voice and reprimanded, do you know that even Her Royal Highness came to this yard later? Although she had other things to do, I know that she must be looking for you. Sulu smiled, took Aunt Susan's hand and said, it's really all right. Her Royal Highness is quite familiar with me now. Aunt Susan was stunned and immediately came to her senses. She spat hard and then slapped his forehead heavily. She laughed and said, this guy has learned to lie and brag now. Sulu covered his aching forehead and said bitterly, this is the truth. Although Her Royal Highness is a good person, she is a noble lady. Don't make fun of her in the future. Aunt Susan said seriously, after she came to the small yard, the guys in the Public Security Bureau no longer dared to take my money. She also never allowed Paul to join the army on the front line. Until last year, Paul went to the military department to make trouble many times. Then he took advantage of the time when Her Royal Highness was not in Tianjing to secretly go to the army. Sulu frowned slightly, not because of pain, but because of doubt. Was Huai Chaosher taking care of Aunt Susan and Paul so much because of him, or was there another reason? Aunt Susan's next sigh answered his question. Chapter 867. Many years ago, in the distant star field of the West Woods of the Federation, on the planet named 5460, an Empire officer named Arthur was executed by military law because he refused to obey the orders of his superiors to slaughter civilians of the Federation. Then, he was buried in the cold ground with more than 9,000 corpses of civilians of the Federation. This Empire officer named Arthur was Aunt Susan's elder brother. I'm proud of him. Aunt Susan turned around and stirred the chowder porridge in the pot. She wiped the corners of her eyes. She didn't know why, but her nerves, which had been tempered by life, had become so delicate and sensitive today. It was as if she had returned to her happy and beautiful childhood. After the hot and fragrant chowder pot was finished, the quiet small courtyard lit up with soft lights. Sulu rushed Zhong Huiyan to wash the dishes. Aunt Susan couldn't persuade him, so she sat down and held his hand to chat. She was concerned about how he had lived these years. At some point, Aunt Susan remembered the story told in the kitchen. She took out a well-preserved diary from the room very carefully and opened it carefully. She continued to talk about her memory of her elder brother and the pride that came from it. This is the diary I gave him when he joined the army. The outside of the diary was a tan coarse calfskin jacket. On the inside page of the plant fiber paper, the content was scribbled in blue-black ink. Sulu silently watched the pages turn one by one in front of him. He didn't tell Aunt Susan that it was he who found her elder brother's body. It was he who brought the diary back to the Empire and returned it to this warm and peaceful small courtyard through Huai Chaosher. After paying the heavy price of 2 broken bowls, Zhong Huiyan finally finished the cleaning work clumsily. She rubbed her red little hands awkwardly and sat back in the chair in the living room. When she saw the scene behind the curtain, she curiously leaned over. Let's play cards for a while? Sulu asked Aunt Susan with a smile. Just like many long nights in the Empire during the escape, the small courtyard began a game of cards that had nothing to do with gambling. The game of the Empire's South Road flower card was really interesting. Zhong Huiyan, who replaced Paul, only spent 3 games before she was deeply immersed in it. Late at night, it was quiet. The provocative sounds of wild dogs and wild cats chasing each other began to sound in the alley outside the courtyard. The small bed was still in the corner of the attic. A table was placed next to the wall facing the window. The tools in the drawer were slightly rusty because they had not been used for a long time. Outside the window, beyond the broken eaves of the slums, one could clearly see the white courtyard under the white moonlight in the distance. Zhong Huiyan was lying on her stomach on the bed with her hands under her chin. She looked curiously at Sulu, who was sitting at the table and working nonstop with tools in his hands. She found that at this time, he, who was not raising his eyebrows or squinting his eyes, finally had the most relaxed and most joyful expression on his face. She could not help but be puzzled. What kind of magic did this small courtyard have that could make him, who was carrying an unimaginable burden, become so calm? She directly asked her doubts. Sulu put down the 6-star knife and soldering iron in his hands, looked at the HD player parts scattered on the table, and whispered, "At that time, I was in the most dangerous moment of my life. I was seriously injured and in a coma. I was trapped in the Empire's net and could die at any time. Aunt had no reason to take me in, but she took me in without asking for any reason." Sulu looked back at the girl on the bed and said with a smile, "A place that can let people see hope in despair is heaven. This small courtyard is heaven for me." After a moment of silence in the attic, his rare emotional voice sounded again. "You've seen that diary just now. What you don't know is that this diary followed that young, proud, determined, and gentle imperial officer for 7 years in the treacherous space, and then was buried deep in the mass grave under Glacier 5460 until Shang Qiu and I discovered its existence that year, and then I brought it to the Empire." Zhong Huiyan looked at him in surprise. "I met Arthur, and then I was saved by Arthur's sister in the Empire. Is this fate or fate? I have learned at least one thing in this small courtyard. Humans may be noble and despicable, but this really has nothing to do with race. Aunt Susan and her brother Arthur are both from the Empire, but they are both noble and kind people." He turned back, picked up the 6-star knife and the microprobe soldering iron, and began to focus and silently assemble the HD player again. He lowered his head and said, "Aunt has tidied up Paul's room. You should go to bed quickly. Tomorrow we will go to Master Fan's mansion." Zhong Huiyan sat up from the bed, peeled off the hair rope from her wrist, and quickly tied her silk-like light chestnut straight hair into a cute bun. She said, I thought the matter over there was important, so we would go to Master Fan's mansion first. Su Li's shoulders sank slightly, and he did not turn back. After a moment of silence, he said, I have been away for so many years, and I am really scared. I am scared that she is dead. The next day's breakfast was spicy noodles and bean paste buns. Under Aunt Susan's loving gaze, Sulu ate very happily. Zhong Huiyan, who still had her hair in a bun, looked very happy. Her eyes were smiling, and she smacked her lips inelegantly, but her legs under the table were obviously a little nervous. I am taking my sister shopping. It is her first time to Tianjing. Sulu took the hot towel from Aunt Susan and wiped his mouth. He said, I will pick you up at the market in the afternoon. Is it still the same old shop? Yes. Aunt Susan answered with a smile, cheered up by his words, because it was still early. The uneven roads in the slums and the dirt between the low-quality cement slabs had not carried too much sewage and pressure, so it did not look so dirty. The dusty green trees on the side of the street mixed with the clear morning light, and they actually looked quite beautiful. If you can't eat, then don't eat. Sulu looked at Zhong Huiyan beside him and said. Today, the young girl was wearing a black dress with a high open collar. Her hair was in an oval bun, revealing her white neck. It was particularly eye-catching when paired with the collar. The slightly cool morning breeze blew a few strands of hair. It was very beautiful, and there was a kind of youthful sexiness. I want to please Auntie. Zhong Huiyan giggled. Sulu smiled and said, there is no need to be so polite. Hearing this, Zhong Huiyan slowly lowered her head. She did not seem to be in a good mood. She kicked a stone in front of her and complained silently in her heart, what a big idiot. After walking for a short distance, the white courtyard quietly waited for them on the other side of the road. This courtyard looked very ordinary, but looking at the courtyard walls that extended very far, one could roughly judge that it occupied a large area. The buildings in the courtyard were all luxurious log structures. The buildings were not tall and were hidden in the green trees, silently exuding the smell of time. The most conspicuous thing about this courtyard was its color. Sulu silently looked at the messy temporary tents and makeshift houses around the courtyard. He knew that these dilapidated buildings must have been rebuilt after the Imperial Army bulldozed them. He retracted his gaze and looked through the slightly open front door of the courtyard. He saw that whether it was the inner walls or the wooden pillars of the buildings inside, they were all painted in the purest white. It was so white that it made people feel disgusted. It was the time when the flowers bloomed in the spring. Although the morning breeze was cold, it blew bursts of flower fragrance through the walls. It curled around the tall green trees and turned into a wonderful smell that penetrated the nose. Although in the slums, the streets around the white courtyard were as clean as a palace. Even the stray cats and dogs did not get up because of last night's tiredness. Around the courtyard, there were many imperial soldiers and police looking around indifferently. Zhong Huiyan felt the tension and solemnity in the air. She narrowed her eyes and asked, how do we get in? Sulu replied, walk in. Zhong Huiyan was stunned. Her thin eyebrows slightly furrowed. She looked at him and said, brother, you're becoming more and more like a third-rate philosopher. I'm not used to it, and I don't like it. Sulu smiled and said, I'm telling the truth. After a pause, he explained, right now, the entire upper echelon of the empire knows who we are and where we are. Since that's the case, we can only pay them a visit. After entering the manor of the Great Master, he politely reported his name and accepted the routine security check. Under the guidance of the housekeeper he had met once before, he walked into the depths of the white courtyard. Along the way, there were flowering trees, green trees, and withered trees. He could see stone walls, wooden walls, and projection walls. He could hear the sounds of reading, discussions, and debates coming from the buildings. There should be many scholars of history holding a seminar on the verification of specific historical facts. Several years ago, when he sneaked into the Great Master's manor, it was at night, and when he fled in a hurry, so Sulu did not see more details of this white courtyard. But today, he was not in the mood and spirit to see the most bizarre place in the left Sky Star region. He was only waiting to meet that guy and ask him some questions. In the innermost part of the white courtyard, the man on the stone steps turned around. His fluttering white robe fluttered in the wind, revealing a pair of dazzling naked legs and a dazzling and perfect face. White streaks of stars could be seen in the tightly tied hair behind his head. His smile was still as shameless as ever. The housekeeper retreated. Sulu looked at the Great Master and could not help but scratch his head. He asked, "Are you waiting for me to come again?" "Of course." The Great Master chuckled and prepared to walk down the stone steps. He said, "Again in the name of love, literature, and peace." Sulu held Zhong Huiyan's small hand and stared at the fluttering white robe around the Great Master's waist. He suddenly thought of an extremely important question. He extended his left hand to cover the girl's eyes and asked in a low voice, "Today, are you wearing underwear?" The great master furrowed his handsome eyebrows. Although he was already very old, that beautiful face of his still had a seductive charm. He was like a demon emitting luster. He said bitterly, "I'm not an exhibitionist." Sulu looked at him mockingly. He was about to open his mouth to mock this guy when he suddenly realized that there were a few cold and slender fingers on his left hand. He looked down in shock and saw that Zhong Huiyan had pulled away his hand that was covering her eyes. She looked at the white-robed great master floating down the stone steps. Her bright black eyes sparkled as she shouted in shock and infatuation, "Brother, look at how beautiful this uncle is." Chapter 868. Back then, when Sulu first saw the great teacher's face, he had the urge to smash this face into a pile of mud. It was not because of anything else, but because this face was too beautiful. It was so beautiful that it made people of the same gender envious and jealous. They wanted to stomp their feet and destroy it tirelessly. Therefore, he understood very well how a young girl growing up in the spring breeze would be shocked when she saw this face. But when he saw that little watermelon, who had always regarded him as her idol, was actually looking at another man, even though he was an old man, he couldn't help but feel unhappy. He pulled the girl to his side with a sullen face and warned her, "Don't be fooled by his looks. He's actually a lunatic." Zhong Huiyan obviously did not care about his warning. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and looked at the great teacher without blinking. She sighed and said, "Even if he is a lunatic, he must be the most beautiful lunatic in the universe. I say, uncle, how did your face grow?" The great teacher looked at the two of them proudly and said, "Cute little princess from the West Woods, this is a secret. If you want to know, we can talk more during this period of time." "Isn't that disgusting?" Sulu frowned and looked at him. "Since you are old enough to be her grandfather, don't pretend to be those wretched uncles." After entering the house, there were 3 cups of tea and a plate of snacks. It was a very simple reception. Sulu sat cross-legged on the dark wooden floor and nodded slightly as a greeting. Then, he began the most important matter of this trip, asking questions. "My first question is, where did Feng Yu go after returning to the Empire with you? Sister said that she got off the spaceship early. In the end, he and you returned to Tianjing planet together." Great Teacher Fan gently held the 2 corners of his white robe and shook it forward to cover his bare legs. He picked up the red mud teacup from the short table and slowly took a sip. Only when Sulu was about to lose his patience did he answer, "I don't know where Feng Yu went. You know that cowardly and shameless teacher of yours, but he is just a little stronger than me. I have to admit that I can't beat him. Furthermore, I owed him a favor last time, so I was too embarrassed to ask Fu Chai for help. Once he helped me, it would be a fight to the death. It doesn't suit my style." Sulu leaned forward slightly and asked, "What about that ship? Are you on that ship?" "It's the ship that your father took to the Federation, the same ship that the female ancestor of the Hua family took to cross the Milky Way to the Empire." "It seems that Shika-chan didn't give you an answer. After all, she hasn't experienced this before." Master Fan put down the teacup and sighed with a lingering regret, "The appearance is the same as my Hua family's boat, so it should be that one." But Nasri did not lie on the wetland. The most important chips should have been removed and used to make those camouflage chips. It is precisely for this reason that I am too lazy to ask him for the boat back. Zhong Huiyan interrupted with a teasing smile, "Is it because you can't beat him?" Master Fan opened his eyes wide and said, "This has nothing to do with fists. That was originally my family's boat. Although my father gave it to that guy, if I really wanted it, would he have the nerve to not give it to me?" Sulu listened to the quarrel between the old man and the young man. His right hand slowly touched his left wrist. His fingertips gently slid across the surface of the warm metal bracelet, feeling the psychological touch brought by the small line of words. He thought silently that most of the chips that Feng Yu removed should be in this bracelet. "What about the star map? Last time, in the room full of black cloth, you told me that you know where the star map is and what the star map is." He looked at the great teacher's beautiful eyes that were like black gemstones and asked in a low voice, "Those chips won't fundamentally affect the control of the spaceship. If we get the star map again, can it fly back?" The content of this sentence was a little strange, or rather, the way he asked the question was a little strange. If the spaceship could fly back, where did it go back? Master Fan slowly sat up straight and looked at Su Li's face silently. After a while, he said, "Although I said it before, I didn't expect you to have guessed most of the puzzle. I can only say that after such a long journey, the spaceship can no longer cross the galaxy as bravely and valiantly as it did in the beginning." After a short pause, he continued calmly, the content of the star map is similar to what you guessed. I also told you where the star map was last time, but you didn't get it back to me. It's very difficult for me to return to the Federation now, especially the capital ring. The ground-to-air defense system there has been greatly improved. I have no doubt that if I tried to get close to the old moon base, I would be directly blown to pieces by those ground-to-air laser cannons. Master Fan smiled and lamented, the last time I went to the Federation, I didn't get to see my beautiful niece. Other than regret, not being able to get the star map is the biggest loss. Fortunately, neither Li Jiedu nor the lady behind Macho know that the star map is hidden in the bracelet on her wrist. Sulu looked at the thick soup in the red clay teacup in silence. His fingertips slowly moved away from the bracelet on his left wrist. It seems that you have a lot of questions to ask after coming all the way to Tianjing to find me. Master Fan smiled and looked at him. Nasri, the spaceship, the star map, what do you want to know? I want to know the origin of the Empire, what is going on with the ancestral planet, and if the Hua family came from the ancestral planet, how did you get here? Sulu looked back into his eyes and said, due to some reasons that are inconvenient for me to explain, I am very interested in some of the technology that the Hua family brought from the ancestral planet. First of all, you need to make one thing clear. At least half of the blood flowing in your body carries the biological mark of the Hua family. Since you're unwilling to admit that your surname is Huai, then you should at least admit that this is our Hua family, and not some fucking Hua family. Master Fan looked at him, frowned, and said, if I tell you this, then what interesting information do you have to give back to me? Now, we can basically confirm that the Federation and the Empire came from the same civilization. You are so obsessed with the future of the Empire, then where did the people of the Federation come from? Sulu put his hands on his knees and looked down. Seeing that the tea in the cup had calmed down, he calmed down and looked straight into Master Fan's eyes. He said, yes, I do know some things recently. Do you want to know? Master Fan's face was expressionless. He dipped his finger into the teacup, dipped it in some of the cold tea, and then put it into his ear, scratching it in an extremely ungraceful manner. The old, middle-aged, and young people in the room sat cross-legged. There were 3 red mud teacups on the dark sandalwood floor. It was just a scene of sitting and chatting. However, because of the content that was about to be discussed, because of Master Fan's ear scratching, the atmosphere in the quiet room suddenly became heavy. The wooden door closed on its own, cutting off the fragrance of flowers, the morning breeze, and the distant voices of people outside. It was because at this moment, they were going to talk about the origins of the Federation and the Empire that no one knew about. This was, without a doubt, the biggest topic of all, the heaviest topic of all. I don't trust your way of doing things, but I trust your conduct in life. I ask that you keep this topic a secret. Otherwise, if it gets back to the Federation, it will definitely cause a lot of trouble. After saying this, Sulu silently stopped talking. He moved back and gave the authority to narrate the story to Zhong Huiyan, who had been silent all this time. The reason for this was probably because he felt that his ability to express himself was not enough to use the simplest words to describe the scene. Zhong Huiyan drank a mouthful of tea and moistened her throat. She said in a clear voice, according to the records in the central database of the Federation, wait a moment. The great teacher raised a finger and interrupted her. He looked at Sulu and asked, from what the little girl is saying, after you escaped from the Federation, you were still able to enter the charter computer? Zhong Huiyan frowned slightly and said, sir, can you be a little more polite? Even in class, you can't just randomly interrupt my content. It was obvious that the girl had returned to the memories of her role as a village teacher. She glanced at the embarrassed great teacher and continued, before the great catastrophe, when the home planet was destroyed by some kind of terrifying weapon, the humans at that time had been preparing for interstellar migration. And this was the beginning of this story. The civilization of the previous generation was obviously more advanced than ours. With the support of powerful technology, their spaceships were able to pass through the dark sky and ignore the long vacuum between the big galaxies. They came to the galaxy where the Federation was located. Then, with great luck, they found a few planets that were very suitable for human survival. Since they were preparing for interstellar migration, then the modification of the planets had been ongoing since the beginning. The humans of the previous generation had been preparing for a very long time. It could have been thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, or even longer. They chose 3 planets, S1, S2, and S3, as experimental planets and carried out a long period of natural environment cultivation and modification work. It was also because of the factor of luck that the distance between the 3 experimental planets and the main stars of their respective galaxies was perfect. The surface covered by the primitive atmosphere could enjoy enough and suitable light. Zhong Huiyan calmly explained, so, the humans of that time didn't need to wear spacesuits and stand on the black reef shouting for light. The first thing they needed to do was to modify the atmosphere that was full of methane and simultaneously eliminate the primitive moss life on the 3 experimental planets. This is a very simple description, but we all know that what we can explain in a few words is a very huge comprehensive project for human society, even for the advanced civilization of the previous generation. It required a terrifying amount of resources and the lifetime efforts of generations of the most advanced scientists. Originally, I wanted to make some slides and use images to describe the development of this great civilization, but that would take too much time. Zhong Huiyan continued, according to the vague records in the central database of the Federation, the modification of the 3 planets by the previous civilization mostly relied on the automatic control of the spaceships. Only machines that ignored the passage of time to a certain extent could travel with the spaceships across the boundless galaxy. Imagine the picture. Countless spaceships that carried the most advanced hubs of the mechanical civilization took off from the surface of the home planet incessantly like arrows. With unstoppable determination and disdain for time, they flew to the other end of the dark universe. Master Fan clenched his hands and exclaimed excitedly, "That was a magnificent era." Chapter 869. Regardless of whether it was the era when the ignorant Federation and the Imperium burst into countless fireworks every time they met in the stars, the era when the military godly Bufu led the soldiers of the Federation into the left heaven space zone and assassinated the Emperor of the Imperium in the middle of thousands of soldiers, or the era when the flames of war continued incessantly and the young heroes shed blood to change their identities. Compared to the soul-stirring interstellar migration tens of thousands of years ago, it was just a scene in history that could be easily washed away. That was the great era when intelligent life society had a system to march into the universe. It was the great era when humans tried to leave their homeland and fundamentally change the form of life. It was a great era that changed the appearance of the entire universe. Sulu understood the great teacher's agitated reaction very well. He silently watched as the great teacher kept slapping his bare thighs, but he did not have any intention of stopping his indecent actions. It was because he had a similar reaction when he first heard Philip tell him about that ancient story for the first time more than 10 days ago. Zhong Huanhua watched as the great teacher gradually calmed down and continued. After the adjustment of the atmosphere was completed, the removal of the low-level anaerobic alien moss was naturally accelerated. Then, the transplanting of plants, all kinds of trees, and all kinds of flowers. I don't think the scientists at that time even forgot about fungi, bacteria, and the like. Then, of course, there were animals. For example, the bison and white birds you saw in the Federation's wetlands were probably the descendants of the animals that crossed the galaxy before humans and scattered on the 3 experimental planets like seeds. In short, there were a lot of them. This was a full replication of the biological library of the ancestral planet. According to the records of the central database, the method of selection of the previous civilization was similar to letting the animals, plants, and even smaller life forms coexist, compete, compromise, and help each other on the 3 experimental planets. Humans did not exert any influence on them. Under the influence of time, life stubbornly survived. The ecosystem completed a strong self-recovery, and the life system of the entire planet began a new cycle. No one could tell how long this long process took, but humans finally obtained the possibility of interstellar migration. The great teacher, who had been silent for a while, frowned, raised his finger, and suddenly interrupted, "This is the way of the Creator." The humans of the previous civilization were not creators. Although their technology was very advanced, they still could not do this. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, "The real creator is the natural environment, and a long period of time. Of course, it also includes life itself." "All right, I agree with you." Master Fan turned to look at Zhong Huiyan and said with emotion, "Every story always needs to ask 3 words. What happened next?" Interstellar migration had already become a reality, but large-scale migration was something that the society at that time could not support. It still needed a period of accumulation. However, at that time, the war that we talked about at the beginning, which is also known as the catastrophe in the Federation's history, arrived on that planet. The planet was reduced to a scorched earth, and mankind was destroyed by the terrible bombs that they developed. At the last moment before the end of the civilization, 5 top scientists who had been involved in the interstellar migration project were lucky enough to activate the last intact spaceship in the base. They broke through the strange lead clouds brought by the war, passed through the dark sky, and successfully arrived at 3 planets without any human beings. They were completely animal paradises. Then it must be a group of 5. The great teacher frowned and asked, the problem is, since there were no humans on the 3 experimental planets, could it be that these 5 scientists were the ancestors of all the people of the Federation? There was only one female in the group of 5, and the books I read mentioned her age. Even if the previous civilization was preserved to a certain extent on that spaceship, I don't think she could have given birth to a child that could carry on the fire of humanity. Sulu explained, according to the records of the charter computer, the last spaceship was classified as an extension model in the migration project. This means that there might be an embryo bank, a biological marker bank, or something like that on that spaceship. That's really lucky. Master Fan could not hide his shock. After a while, he had a new question. He stared at Feng Luo and asked, but even if there is an embryo bank, how do you cultivate it? Sulu shrugged. There should be some kind of equipment that can complete this task. Speaking of which, the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation has always been leading the entire universe in the field of biotechnology, but it is strictly confidential. Other than the production of protein-synthesized meat, it is forbidden to use it in any military aspect. I'm wondering if it has something to do with this. It sounds a little disgusting. Master Fan grumbled a few words. He picked up the cold tea in front of him and drank it in one gulp. Beads of sweat flowed down his forehead. He said mockingly, so, other than being test tube babies, the people of the Federation are also made by machines. Is this important? Sulu asked seriously. It's fine as long as they are alive. Master Fan thought for a while and answered seriously, it is indeed not important. Don't ask me where that spaceship is. Sulu looked at his eager appearance and stopped him in advance. That spaceship no longer exists. The main control computer is now the Federation's charter computer. The parts of the spaceship have been dismantled and are now under the Bureau of Proclamation as the core protection layer of the charter computer. Master Fan sighed again. A spaceship computer, in our era, can become the shining existence above the entire Federation and make the entire Empire fear it. That civilization of the previous generation is really unimaginably powerful. After knowing these things, I've been thinking that perhaps it was because the technology of the previous generation was too advanced that led to the catastrophe later. Sulu stretched out his hand and gently turned the red mud teacup. He said in a low voice, the whole interstellar migration project cost a lot of money. The resources of the entire ancestral planet dried up because of this. The social conflicts intensified, and the ideologies clashed. Then, an extremely cruel and desperate war broke out. Both sides had technology and weapons that we can't imagine. Once the war started, it was impossible to end it. Master Fan sighed and said, that is not something we can understand. That's about all that we know about the Federation, Li Tianlan said. Sulu raised his head and looked into his eyes. As an exchange of information, it's your turn to tell the story of the Left Sky Star region. With your story as a blueprint, the story of the Left Sky Star region will be much easier to tell. Master Fan looked at the two of them and slowly said, ever since our ancestors came to the Left Sky Star region, our Master Fan Manor has been studying all kinds of original data for more than 700 years. Now, we can confirm one thing, and that is that the civilization of the Left Sky Star region must have originated from the ancestral planet. As you said, the ancestral planet of the previous generation was not a monolithic entity. There must be different factions at odds, or else such a desperate war would not have happened. Since the technological level of both sides is similar, when the faction of the 5-man group was planning the interstellar migration, the other faction must also be making the relevant preparations, and they must be hiding it from each other. When the 5-man group took the last spaceship to S1, the other faction, which was in a state of destruction, also took a spaceship to the experimental planet they chose, or should I say, the ranch. However, the humans who came to the Left Sky Star region were clearly not as prepared as the 5-man group, so although they had more people and more spaceships, the process of exploring the universe was much more difficult. The Left Sky Star region was like a black hole, constantly swallowing those desperate or brave pioneers. In this process, the technology of the previous generation continued to disappear along with the loss of human life, which also led to the current empire's technological level falling behind that of the Federation. Although this is not the decisive factor, the influence is very far-reaching. What is the decisive factor? Zhong Huiyan asked, puzzled. The decisive factor is that your charter computer has been intentionally or unintentionally controlling the development of the Federation's technology. The great teacher looked at the young lady and said calmly, the Empire does not have such restrictions, so it has been chasing after each other for tens of thousands of years. Fortunately, when the two sides met again, the gap was already very small. Sulu was silent, thinking about the distant barbaric era, the fleeing humans who took a spaceship to the left Skystar region, facing the unfamiliar and dangerous planets, yet stubbornly survived. He could not help but feel a chill, and then he was filled with endless respect. The survivors of the previous generation's civilization could only rely on their numbers and relatively backward navigation to fight against the dangerous universe. It is also because of this reason that the left Skystar region's policy of encouraging reproduction has never changed for tens of thousands of years. According to statistics, the current empire has over 90 billion registered citizens, but the actual number of people far exceeds this. The great teacher spread out his hands and said, "Both are interstellar immigrants, but due to the slight differences at the very beginning, it leads to the differences in many aspects of the two human societies. However, at the end of the day, both the Federation and the Empire have taken an extremely similar path. After all, we are all survivors of the same race and origin. It's just that before we met, both sides did not know that there were companions on the other side of the universe." This beautiful man slowly closed his eyes and then slowly opened them again. He looked at the two of them and said solemnly, "Could it be that the destiny of humans is to split up and then be destroyed together? Could it be that the Federation and the Empire are going to repeat the fate of the humans on the ancestor planet from countless tens of thousands of years ago? I am now more and more certain that the Federation and the Empire do not need anything else but peace." Hearing the word peace, Sulu was silent for a very long time. He did not give any direct response to the great teacher's firm declaration, but asked expressionlessly, "The problem now is that the Hua family is not from the Empire. You came from the ancestor planet, which means that after the catastrophe, the ancestor planet did not become a ruin of absolute death. There are still humans who survived. Then, what is the ancestor planet like now? I know what you're worried about." The great teacher shook his head and said, "Time can erase too many memories." How the ancestors came to the left Skystar region from the ancestor planet is only left with some almost mythical records in this white courtyard. However, you can rest assured that the civilization on the ancestor planet is far from the civilization of the previous generation. Naturally, there won't be any battleships carrying terrifying weapons coming from the other side of the dark sky curtain to wipe out the Empire and the Federation. The civilization has not recovered. Sulu asked, "Then, what about the ship that the Hua family's ancestors were on? That ship should also be a remnant of the previous generation's civilization. No matter how terrifying the catastrophe was, there should be some advanced things left behind on that planet that was once filled with the fruits of the previous generation's civilization." The great teacher continued to explain, "After the ancestor came to the left Skystar region, she never left. This means that even she did not have the ability to repair that ship to the extent that it could pass through the dark sky curtain again and return to the ancestor planet. A woman from a backward civilization taking the advanced spaceship of the previous generation civilization and resolutely heading to an unfamiliar star region. This is equivalent to a baby picking up an advanced rifle and pulling the trigger on a mecha without hesitation." Zhong Huiyan's eyes were wide open as she said in shock. Furthermore, she successfully arrived at the left Skystar region and shot through the cockpit of that mecha. This is truly inconceivable. The great teacher smiled and said, "That's why the Hua family's ancestors taught us that the truly ferocious characters in the world are all women." Chapter 870. The stories that needed to be told and the context that needed to be clarified were clearly laid out on the dark wooden floor through the three people's casual narration. The room returned to silence. The three people sitting cross-legged on the floor did not open their mouths like the red clay teacups in front of them. Instead, they were as silent as the teacups. After a long time, the great teacher once again pulled his soft white robe down to cover the slender legs that had been exposed due to his excitement. He looked at Sulu and Zhong Huiyan and asked with an indescribable emotion, "I say, for such a big matter, such an important matter, the three of us are like idlers who have nothing to do after eating, sitting on the sofa and talking about celebrity scandals. Wouldn't that seem disrespectful to history and disrespectful to our predecessors? What else can we do?" Sulu lowered his head and replied in a muffled voice, "Are we going to hold a joint press conference between the two sides of the universe and invite Huai Fuchai and Pabre to attend together?" Zhong Huiyan looked at the great teacher's face and added harshly, "Are we going to invite Jian Shuer to sing for fun while Her Highness and Madmanly operate mechas and dance in front? I just feel that the importance of the discussion and the atmosphere of the discussion are too big. Great Teacher Fan laughed bitterly and then looked at Sulu and said seriously, however, there are still many details in these stories that have not been clarified. As the only comparative literature researcher in the Federation, you know that I value these details very much. The details decide everything. It's fine. I still want to stay here for a while. Sulu replied, as for those details, I think there should be some historical materials in this courtyard. I want to take a look. No problem. After all, the blood of the Hua family flows in your body. Great Teacher Fan frowned slightly and looked at him. However, before opening up these historical materials, I have a question. Based on your personality, why are you suddenly so interested in the history of the Empire and the Federation? In other words, we have now clarified some of the historical clues. What is the significance of this to you? Sulu was silent for a moment, then looked up and sincerely replied, I don't know. As you said, I am a guy who doesn't have the spirit of exploration. I may be curious about those ancient stories, but I don't have the desire to follow and explore. Master Fan nodded and said in a regretful tone, on the contrary, that little Tai Ziyuan you introduced me to should be more interested in these stories. However, I heard that he wants to run for president of the Federation, so we can't expect too much from him. Why? Sulu asked in confusion. The difference between a politician and an explorer is like the difference between a cat and a dog, Master Fan replied. After a short pause, he stared into Sulu's eyes and suddenly said, I think I understand why you are suddenly interested in these things. It is because ever since your identity was exposed, you have been wandering in the universe for years without a clear identity. This kind of confusion is very dangerous, and you want to solve this problem. Sulu's eyes slowly narrowed, and his pupils gradually shrank. He said, What do you mean? You want to prove something. You want to prove that since the people of the Empire Federation are all from the ancestral planet, then they are all humans. The great teacher looked straight into his eyes and said calmly, if that is the case, then it is no longer important whether you are a person of the Federation or a person of the Empire. Only then can your state of mind be truly peaceful. Perhaps, but I am not one of those philosophers who like to ask and have the willpower to think about where I came from. I am not even a third-rate philosopher. Sulu glanced at Zhong Huayan and continued, other than some reasons that I cannot tell you, I really don't understand why I am suddenly interested in these things. However, I have a vague feeling that these stories may be very important to me, and to many people. For Sulu, the library was a place with deep memories. The libraries of Tennessee State University and Ua University had occupied a very important place in his short life. In the past 2 years of traveling in the various prefectures of the Empire, he had also visited many historical libraries with royal prefixes and collected many books. A small portion of those books filled the simple classroom in Sanku Town, while most of them were randomly thrown in a secluded corner of the spaceship. However, he knew that the library in this white courtyard was definitely completely different from the libraries he had seen before. It was because history was stored here and secrets were hidden here. Otherwise, why would those heavy black cloths still be floating in the room that he had visited before? The wooden door slowly slid open, revealing the layers of black cloths that were trembling slightly in the wind. Thousands of files of various styles were neatly arranged in the space separated by the black cloths. Because no one had read them for many years, the thick books exuded a deathly stillness. This is the family rule set by the ancestor. For some reason, she likes the black cloths very much. Master Fan pointed at the black cloths hanging straight in the spacious room and explained to the two people behind him, although the ancestor has passed away for hundreds of years, no one dares to disobey her rules. Sulu took off his shoes and put on the prepared white footwear. He walked into the quiet room. Zhong Huayan placed his shoes neatly outside the door and then quickened her pace to follow him. Master Fan accompanied them to the second door and refused to go in again. In his words, he had read these lifeless records since he was young, and there were too many bad memories in his mind. He did not want to repeat the torture. However, just before he left, he suddenly looked into Sulu's eyes and said, I found the answer to the question. Sulu asked, What? Peace. Master Fan's smile was like a flower. You want peace? Only now did Sulu understand why he was suddenly interested in these secrets. After a moment of silence, he replied, If I don't think about what I did on the battlefield, if I don't think about the discussion I had with Commander Zhong about whether or not the progress of the war has been reached, whether or not I am a third-rate philosopher, I must admit that I am in a crack right now. The reason I am not returning to the Federation is because I cannot find a solution to this problem. Because of my identity, I do not have any leeway to choose. His eyebrows, as thick as ink, were still as straight as a blade. His expression was still calm, but at this moment, he appeared particularly serious. He looked into the great teacher's eyes and said, I can only hope that the two sides can achieve peace. What if they can't? In a limited space, both sides need resources, especially the current Federation. However, when the Federation seizes enough resources and grows stronger, what will the Empire do? Will a lion with a new set of sharp teeth let go of the prey in its mouth? If the Empire survives and begins to counterattack, will the wolves whose homes have been destroyed give up their desire for revenge? If the war between the Empire and the Federation is destined to continue forever and tragically, what will you do? What can you do? Like the tragic hero in the 8-part opera, sacrifice your life for this tragic fate? In front of the heavy and drooping black cloth, the great teacher's calm tone was like a bullet without feeling, pressing forward coldly and valiantly. Sulu looked at him and replied, I am not that kind of person. If I had the strength or power of the 8-part opera's hero, I would have killed the Emperor directly and ended that war. Killing an emperor can only end one war, and as long as human society is in a state of division, there will never be only one war. No one can control the world after death. It is even impossible to deduce what effect one's current actions will have on the world after death. Therefore, I can only be responsible for the world I am alive in. Very good. A few years ago, I locked you and Xiaoshi in this courtyard because I wanted to do this. I am very happy that you can now return to the right track. The great teacher looked at him with a smile that was not a smile and said, in my opinion, you have always wanted to kill Pabre, regardless of whether it is for the sake of the girl beside you or for any other reason. Now, you seem to have an extremely powerful reason, and that is to end the war. Then, can you tell me, when do you plan to return to the Federation and kill Pabre? Pabre is not the Emperor. Killing him will not end this war, and I am not the creator. I can use absurd reasons like finding him an eyesore to kill him, but I will not be so hypocritical as to use the reason of universal peace to kill him. If you can kill Pabre, then I am willing to take the risk to kill your father, and the real Emperor will cooperate with you. Sulu was stunned for a moment before he understood what the great teacher was saying. His thick brows slowly furrowed as he looked at him and said in confusion, just now, you said that chatting is a bit unfair to the grand interstellar migration story. Is it not so frivolous for us to talk about this while standing barefoot in front of the black cloth? Can you give me some slightly more feasible and normal suggestions? Killing the President of the Federation and the Emperor of the Empire is, without a doubt, the simplest and most direct way to end this war. My suggestion is very feasible. The great teacher looked at him and shook his head. He sighed and said, it is a pity that you are afraid of being accused of being hypocritical and are unwilling to accept the former. Student Fu Chai is also your biological father. Sulu frowned and was speechless. Back then, I once told you that, according to a distant and almost blurred legend, although my ancestor was the biggest war oligarch, he was also the person who hated war the most. War oligarch. That's right. He is the father of the female ancestor of the Hua family. It seems very complicated. It's more complicated than you think. The great teacher Fan waved his hand and continued, based on family teachings, both my father and I have been thinking about a way to end this war. My father's idea is to carry out racial integration, which is also the seed plan that the Federation mentioned, especially the fusion of the blood of the royal family and the Federation. My idea is another type of integration. Back then, I thought that if you and Xiaoshi could get married, that would be the best thing that could happen. Unfortunately, you are no longer the successor of the Federation's military god. Instead, you have become her biological younger brother. The great teacher Fan looked at Sulu, whose expression was somewhat ugly. He smiled and said, but I heard that President Pabre has a daughter called Miss Dell. This young girl fanatically worships you. Do you want to try dating her? The Federation president has become the father-in-law of the Empire's crown prince. How can this war continue? Sulu spread out his hands helplessly and said with a sigh, other than the reproductive revolution, can you think of something else? Chapter 871. Lifting up the black cloth, they walked into the pile of historical papers belonging to the mysterious Hua family. The carefully designed window allowed sunlight to pass through but not piquing eyes, making this secluded journey particularly warm. However, Sulu and Zhonghuiyan did not stay in this room for too long. When the sun began to emerge from the window and was about to change its name to sunset, they walked out. Master Fan held the teapot, closed his eyes, and sat peacefully and happily on the bamboo recliner under the big tree. He seemed to have forgotten the humiliating time when Feng Yu threw him naked on the tree. Hearing the sound of footsteps behind him, he opened his eyes and looked sideways. He asked in surprise, finished reading so quickly? Master Fan's family history in the Empire is more than 700 years. Of course, it's impossible to finish reading it so quickly. In fact, I've only read half of that female ancestor's mood diary. But time is up, so I have to leave. Sulu replied. Leave? Where are you going? The Federation? Master Fan asked with a frown. Sulu answered, we're going to the market. We'll come back tomorrow. Master Fan slapped his thigh heavily, leaving an angry palm print on his white and tender skin. He cursed a famous line from Schiller's early comedy script. Come back tomorrow? What do you think my place is? A public toilet? You think you can come and go as you please? Sulu had read this script. He smiled and did not explain too much. Holding Zhong Huiyen's hand, they walked out of the white courtyard briskly under Master Fan's scolding. The setting sun cast countless oblique shadows on the shabby streets of the slums. The two of them walked in these shadows. They passed through the alleys under 3 locust trees and arrived at the market. Under the curious gazes of the surrounding stalls, they arrived at Aunt Susan's shop. The steaming dinner, the warm atmosphere, and the quiet night in the small courtyard of the slums seemed so warm. After eating to their heart's content, it was Zhong Yanhua's turn to wash the dishes unwillingly but still with a sweet smile on her face. After chatting for a while, the 3-person game of the Imperial South Road flower card began fiercely again until late into the night. In the attic, Sulu quietly assembled the improved HD video player. His fingers, which did not seem to be very nimble, were as stable and precise as a machine. At an unbelievable speed, he turned the scattered components into a good toy that the young masters of the noble families in the capital of the empire could not help but feel sore again. For him, being able to occasionally smell the smell of machinery in such a peaceful day was a very happy thing, just like chatting about cards during dinner. Zhong Huiyen was lying on her stomach on the small bed. She supported her chin with her hands and her legs were bouncing up and down mischievously. Her beautiful eyes, which were like black gemstones, were quietly focused on Sulu, who was sitting beside the table. Men are sexiest when they're working hard? It seemed that the women's magazines she read when she was young said so, the young girl thought. Brother, when you were sleeping under the sun in Master Fan's manor during the day, I carefully read the mood diary. I increasingly feel that the ancestor of the Hua family was an amazing woman. Sulu carefully placed the soldering iron on the metal blade of the 6-star knife. He turned back to look at the young girl on the bed. After a moment of silence, he replied, I don't want you to become such an amazing woman. Why? Zhong Huiyen rolled up from the bed. She opened her eyes wide and looked back at him very seriously. Sulu knew how to answer. From the last time he met Huai Chaoshi, Zhong Huiyen yearned for that kind of life, that kind of valiant life, but, Sulu thought for a moment. He looked at her and said gently, whether it's the ancestral planet, the Federation, or the Empire, many things may have changed on the surface, but in fact, there are many things that haven't changed. One of the most important things is the relationship between men and women. Why are there so few women like the ancestor of the Hua family or Huai Chaoshi? Because it's very hard, and I don't want you to live too hard. The small talk was just an interlude. He didn't know if the young girl had a sleepless night downstairs. In any case, Sulu slept very soundly. It was as if he had returned to the time when he was seriously injured and fleeing. It was in this attic that he felt a sense of security and relaxation. In the days that followed, this kind of happy life was repeated. When he woke up early in the morning, Sulu often saw the young girl selling massed flowers behind the morning rain alley. Sometimes he would stick his head out of the attic window and shout. Then he would throw out the chestnuts he had eaten last night with banknotes. They would fall at the girl's feet. Then he would put a large bouquet of fragrant white flowers on the stone steps of the door. Every time this happened, Zhong Huiyen would squat by the well in the kitchen and brush her teeth angrily. She didn't know why she was angry. Sulu wanted to go into the kitchen to help his aunt prepare dinner, but she stubbornly refused to look at him or give way. Her mouth was full of white foam, and her cheeks were very round. It was very cute. After breakfast, Sulu rode an electric tricycle, hitched a ride with Zhong Huiyen and the high-definition video player he had made last night, and went to the market. After rolling up the heavy rolling gate, he took Zhong Huiyen's hand and went to the great teacher to bury himself in the pile of old books again. No matter how the young girl threw at him, he smiled and refused to let go. The great teacher fan mansion was very quiet and the sun was very good. The great teacher was angry, helpless, and numb. He was too lazy to care about the siblings, so Sulu had a very good environment. He slept soundly under the clear sunshine to make up for the hard work of working overtime last night. As for the pile of old books that might carry many secrets, naturally, the very interested Zhong Huiyen examined them carefully. The sun was setting again, and they returned to the small courtyard. Late at night, Aunt Susan slept soundly with a smile on her face. Sulu was working in the attic. Zhong Huiyan began to talk about the useful information and interesting things that she had seen in the Great Teacher Fan Mansion during the day. Most of the interesting things were related to the female ancestor of the Hua family. She copied a poem in the pages of the Imperial Geographical Record. The author was called Li Ji. The note said that the author was also a woman. But the problem is that I used the Great Teacher Fan Mansion search instrument for a long time, but I couldn't find such a person in the history of the imperial literature. I suspect that this female poet named Li Ji should be a character from the ancestral planet. Brother, are you listening? Yes. Listen carefully to this poem. Near to the far east and west, deep to the shallow clear stream. High to the sun and moon, close to family and distant husband and wife. It's really well written. Zhong Huiyan sat on the bed and leaned against the wall. She stared at Su Li's back without blinking and said, close to family and distant husband and wife. You and Sister Shui are only engaged, but you haven't married yet. You can't say that you're close to her. It's been almost 3 years, and she hasn't said anything about looking for you. Sulu didn't turn around. He smiled and said, then are you going to let Shang Qiu or Nan Xiangmei be your sister-in-law? Hearing this answer, Zhong Huiyan twisted her fingers and bit the corner of her lips. She was angry and didn't say anything. Life was just like that. It was dull, warm, and safe. No one came to disturb them, including the imperial palace. There was no follow-up news. Today, Sulu was no longer the fugitive of the Federation. He was the only male heir of the imperial family. Therefore, he didn't need to fear the secret agents everywhere in Tianjing, and the chip detectors that could be found everywhere. However, on such a happy day, under the warm sun of the Empire, he couldn't help but miss everything about the Federation. He missed his friends over there. He was very happy, so he hoped that they could be happy too. There was a faint shadow in his happy life. According to the usual practice, Paul's monthly allowance would be transferred to Aunt Susan's account around the 12th. However, it was already the 20th of this month, and the number in the bank account still hadn't changed. When Aunt Susan was cooking, she was obviously a little absent-minded, and she lost even more when playing the South Road flower card. You don't have to worry, I know some news from the front line. There hasn't been a big war in Mo Hua planet for 2 months. Moreover, the front line is too far from here, so the communication of information is not smooth. It's normal for the allowance to be sent back a few days later. Aunt Susan shook her head, looked at Su Lu, and said, that child signed an allowance distribution agreement with the military logistics department before he went to the front line. Now, a large part of his allowance will be automatically deducted every month and transferred from the department to my account. All of it is electronically transferred. He only needs to make an electronic signature confirmation at the front line. It's impossible for him to be delayed by the journey. The fact that the allowance hasn't arrived yet can only mean that the logistics department hasn't gotten his electronic signature confirmation. Sulu continued to comfort her. This doesn't mean anything. If Paul is really in the personal guard camp, then the straight-line distance between him and Her Royal Highness won't be more than 2 kilometers. It's impossible for him to be in too much danger. As for the delay in the electronic signature confirmation, it may be because Her Royal Highness is out on patrol or something like that. He has to follow her all the way and doesn't have time to deal with it. I hope so. Aunt Susan forced a smile. If comfort was useful, there wouldn't be so many sad love songs in the world. What's more, a mother and son's heart were connected. Once the worry started, it couldn't be stopped. Countless terrible conjectures made Aunt Susan toss and turn at night, unable to sleep peacefully. Perhaps it was because she caught a cold. In the quiet night below the small courtyard, from time to time, there were painful coughs that couldn't be suppressed. Sulu put on his pajamas, gently walked down the attic, and went into the kitchen to boil water. He took out a pear from the refrigerator, peeled it, put it into a bowl, put it in the pot, and waited quietly for the pear to be steamed. Then, he slowly raised it in warm water for Aunt Susan to eat when she got up tomorrow. The next morning, Aunt Susan habitually went to the market to sell goods with her sick body. She was stopped by Su Lu, fed her medicine, and then returned to the small courtyard from Master Fan Manor early at noon. The steamed pear in the kitchen was still on the stove, still warm, but Aunt Susan was gone. There was a note left by the stove with 2 lines of scribbled handwriting on it. Because of some inconvenient reasons, we can only ask you to meet us in this way. I believe that this is enough to show our sincerity and determination. Sulu slowly clenched his right hand, and the note in his palm shattered under the pressure of an invisible force. He looked back at the clean wooden door of the small courtyard, and his eyes slowly narrowed with a murderous look. He thought blankly, someone is forcing me to kill someone again. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.